Okay.
Okay, perfect.
We're on record.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our first thesis conversation for the summer. So this is what we're calling the miniature review. And it's something that I think Florencia started kind of a few years back as an idea to jumpstart the thesis project through a very small model that captures a kind of aesthetic sensibility, but also the project in a bite-sized format. And I think those of you who are here, because we invited today alumni of SCI-Arc to join us for the discussion, you're probably familiar with this format, but it would be curious actually to hear from you a little bit also as a way to introduce you. So Ryan and Maya, could you just say a few words where you are, when you finished SCI-Arc, and what your project was when you were doing thesis here?
Maya, do you want to go first?
Like, God damn, it's not fast. And I was like, Ryan, do you want to go first? Yes, as I said, I'm currently in Europe, but I'm actually on the East Coast. After graduating, I worked myself a little bit around the planet. I worked in Shanghai and in Rome and also in LA, but then I went back to the East Coast. I worked at Syracuse University for a while, and then now I'm teaching at UPenn for the last 1.5 years. My thesis project was called The Bastardized Gestalt, and it was about, obviously, Gestalt theory in contemporary urban conditions, in this case, Berlin. And what does that mean about architecture and identity and image culture today?
I'm Ryan Martinez. I graduated from SCI-Arc in 2013. I worked with Erico and Moss when I was at SCI-Arc, along with Jeff Kipnis, who was there at the time as a kind of special advisor. My thesis was interested in authorship, particularly in regard to the architect, and a kind of data collection of information that we as architects create, but also insert into the process of our work. I'm currently teaching at Woodbury University here in Burbank, California.
I forgot to mention class of 2012, and my advisor was Elena Manfredini.
Thanks, Maya and Ryan. And we're also joined by Brian DeLuna. Will you introduce yourself as well, Brian? Welcome.
Yeah, hi. My name is Brian DeLuna. I believe it's SCI-Arc class. I did my undergrad at SCI-Arc, so my BA I think I finished 2007 or 2008. It's a little blurry. Then went to Columbia. Then I don't know how much detail people went into, but worked for Hernan for many years back in the day. And then went to work for Asymptote, and then I went to teach at Princeton, New Jersey, NJIT, Rensselaer Polytechnical Institute, the School of Applied Arts in Vienna, and I'm currently at the University of Pennsylvania and Pratt, and have my own little office where I'm trying to get some stuff built.
Also be joined a little bit later by Ben Weisgall, who is an alum of, I guess, 2019. And he's been the assistant teacher here working in Androzago Studios, and then he's continuing on to do his PhD at Columbia GCEP. So probably in about an hour, he'll join us as well. I'm Anna Neymark. I have 6 students presenting today, and we are co-hosting today with Zeina Koretam. Zeina will have 3 students. So we have about 19 minutes per student now that we've done our introductions. And I'm going to pass the mic to Christopher. We'll jump right in.
Hi, just before Christopher, let me say hi. Hi, Maya, Brian, and Ryan, and all the students. Thank you for joining us. So I look forward. I'm going to be in and out of different reviews, so text me, Anna, if there are any issues. Thank you so much for joining. See you later.
Thank you.
Ciao.
All right, I'm just gonna share. All right. Do you guys see this?
Yes.
It's good. All right. So my name is Christopher, and my thesis title is Table of Content. So I use the analogy of the table to begin to discuss means of selection, inclusion, and collection and accumulation of differences. The thesis table of content examines an architecture that is promiscuous in its abilities to include. The table, located in between those who have it in common, it serves as the thing that both relates and separates people at the same time. To bring something to the table is to make a contribution or an offer to the discussion. But in order to bring something to the table, it requires the table to always already be there. This thesis explores the table as a building typology in order to discuss the current state of public buildings and how we engage with them as infrastructural monuments. The project is centered around federal programs such as preservation, conservation, inventory, archive, management of land, juxtaposed with the pre-existing public plaza at Pershing Square, and tries to imagine a federal building like a table. And in the project, I'm working with two types of conditions definitions of the word tabula. One which is like the geometrical understanding of the furniture table with a flat top and one or more legs that provide a surface from which object may be placed. And the other one, tabulate, which is a system to bring things into relation, simply through statistics or systematic arrangement. This is the sort of research leading up to now, where I'm kind of researching the 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional relationships between table and tabulation in both art and architecture. So the 2020 vision for the project basically goes back to the Situationist ontology and written by Guy Debord. He writes, "The admirers of portals of Chartres should be silenced. Beauty, when it's not a promise of happiness, must be destroyed. And what could be more repugnant representation of unhappiness than such monuments to everything in the world that remains to be overcome, to the numerous aspects of life that remain inhumane." And on the right, we have a federal building in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, which was completed in 2012 by HBRA architects. And I think in general, I'm trying to think about the notion between public buildings and how we always have to push ourselves to innovate and not look back in time to try to find solutions for the future. That's why I'm trying to like here diagram certain relationships between the federate and the corporate, the public and the private, dealing with access. And the federal and the corporate is mainly in the trajectory between how things are being managed. The project that I'm imagining and working on is a mixed-use hybrid program that tries to bring things into relation through like sort of an idea of the tabulate. So the federal program as well as the corporate programs and at the table square to kind of bridge the things together. The corporate programs are like co-working spaces, event spaces, and self-storage. And the federal programs are, as I mentioned before, the inventory, archive, conservation, land management, and preservation. And in the diagram, try to put out all of them in like a hierarchy and try to like find relationships between each of the programs. Pershing Square has been and the development has been used as a sort of democratic test site for a lot of developments through the early beginning of LA's like history back to the 1800s. And I think the reason why I'm placing the project there is to get an idea of like how to incorporate a building into an already existing sort of public identity. This is sort of an idea of a massing that tries to detach itself from its surroundings, raising itself from the bottom existing plaza and then raising itself and allowing for people to kind of ascend to the table, passing through the federal programs. These are some model tests that I've been working on, exploring like techniques and let's say sort of blank surface versus dense surface, like coloration and figuration and different types of sort of raised conditions. Other one which is a little bit more like explorative, and like figures in materials, sort of a digital version that I had to make because I'm in Europe as well and had to ship it. So my friend Nero had to build this model and put it in the SCI-Arc gallery. And then I just want to end on the 2020 biennial, a quote from Paulo Barata under the topic how we live together. We find it useful if a biennial can remind everyone that the identity of a society or community lies in the qualities of the project it formulates for its future. To correct distortion and valorize resources, these projects can only arise from extensive awareness and widespread collaboration. And I think I use this as a sort of attitude towards trying to imagine something new on the site, and maybe also trying to make some kind of bold moves as well, as I know that the history of Pershing Square is also something to take into consideration. But I understand that this as a speculative project needs to detach itself from some of the existing building conditions. So I'm going to stop sharing again now. And thank you so much.
And Christopher, do you have the link to your issue document that you can post for everybody to?
Yeah, I can do that. Yeah, let me just 1 second. All right, there you go.
Hey, I don't know if it's rude for me to start, but I didn't know it'd be rude before. Christoph, let me ask you, where in the world are you?
I'm in Copenhagen.
Copenhagen. Nice, nice. So things are probably a little better for you than they are.
Yeah.
Here in New York. You know, just I want to start by saying, like, I really enjoy the topic and the idea. I think it's a super interesting one, especially when you start to broach the idea of sort of a democratic position on your thesis. I love the idea of table. You know, the reason why I asked you where you are currently is the things I'm about to talk about are actually quite maybe boring to an American, but maybe interesting for you. I don't know if you've ever done the drive across America, but
only partly.
Okay, there's this really gorgeous part of the plateaus, which is like translates to the tabletop.
In Arizona?
Yeah, I'm trying to open it. I think it's in Arizona, but it might be Utah. See, I should know my better, but it comes from it has it for and then there's the tableau. I was thinking of those projects. I was also thinking of the oldest structure in America, which is Mesa Verde, which, hold on, I have to translate that real quick. It means green table, Mesa Verde. And it actually is, if you look at it, it's a huge sort of cliff overhang, and then they built underneath it for reasons of kind of shelter in that sense. So I think that those are two sort of interesting just within like a landscape discussion. And then I also think that the discussion of a blank slate or the tabula rasa, which also comes from, I guess, the French meaning of the word table. So I think that which means like a blank slate as well, to start from scratch. So using those sort of three kind of ideas, I think that there's a way of looking, because the Mesa Verde is sort of understanding the underbelly and then putting like a democratic system or a colony of people underneath it for shelter that happens underneath the project. The plateau, which I think has to do with, you know, I'm not an expert on the plateaus in America, but I believe it's a system of erosion and density within the rock, which is maybe something interesting to also study, which is when we're looking at your studies, if I were to think of like the idea of like its solidity, its materiality, its density and how it can start to look through erosion, or I guess the plateaus over time. So it's not just this like bound object at the end, which like the table kind of refers to, but sort of breaking that down. And then the tabula rasa idea of a blank slate. I mean, the tabula rasa normally refers to like a painting or a blank painting, but it also is a form of like talking about starting like a French, like at a completely new beginning for like a child, right? Like it's a blank slate or a blank table, I guess is probably the translation from French. And then I have to say that I love the sort of imagery that you were showing for the models. I would say that the danger zone for me is to get more into America. It's the, I believe it was for the LACMA, the Swiss architect. I'm drawing a blank right now. What's his name? Zumthor.
Zumthor. Yeah.
Zumthor kind of had one of those figures where it's an elevated sort of like table, right? But he tries to do this sort of like figural change within it that I don't know. Oh, by the way, the tableau that I thought was interesting, it's a group of models or motionless figures representing a scene of a story from history. So I thought that the tableau, like, I thought that was kind of for tabula rasa. So like a group of models of motionless figures representing a scene from a story or from history, I think is, so it's taking that and then blanking it, right? Which is an interesting sort of concept as well within your figures, because. And then just lastly, before I overtalk, I think that there's like this sort of interesting idea that you're also working with. And I think that there's a good example in Berlin when it comes to democratic, where you have Mises sort of one for the museum, where it's just this one roof with one entry and like one staircase down, which is sort of one side, and then just to the right-hand side of it is the very democratic sort of version for the music, the Philharmonic, which it has like many entries, many levels, and there's sort of zero hierarchy to that project. So there's an issue of hierarchy. I think you are able to, I think, have many entries, so there isn't this sort of one door for everybody sort of mentality, like where so it's a little bit more democratic with that, and the democraticness of that space. I think that there's an interesting unbuilt project by Louis Kahn that actually bridges across a river for a parliament. That's a really interesting precedent. And also, I think, lastly, Lisinski's horizontal skyscraper, which maybe you're probably already studying within that as well, as an idea of like moving horizontally within a like sort of vertical structure. But I think that they're really great. I think the models are what's the most interesting for me at the time. I love it when they were like almost like the ones that were starting to kind of fall apart were actually my favorite, let's say, where I could read the like sort of mass in the middle and these like sort of cracking when it started to get to this like really rich textures. I found really fascinating.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Brian, thanks for jumping in. That was amazing. I want to also introduce Eric Gonoy, who just joined. Hi, Eric. I'm sure you're kind of jumping in and out of many sessions, but just as a quick intro, Eric has been working with many of the thesis students from the history theory side and really thinking through these projects from thesis prep into the summer. So I'm really glad that you're able to jump in. Thanks, Eric.
Christoph, thank you so much for your presentation. It was really interesting. I really like the topic as well. I just to give you a disclaimer, I might come from a too biased topic. My partner Daniela and I have been working on this tabula non rasa project that is ultimately actually a table design, but it conceptually talks about, it goes at the problem maybe a little bit from a different angle than you, just so so this is my disclaimer. Just the reason why I'm making the disclaimer is because ultimately your research and everything I think is really interesting, and I agree with Brian that the models are really interesting. They're to me also interesting because they're the gaze is different. Like the miniature or the model view allows you to actually look at the table as it is a table, right? Which I mean, we in our project we reference, for example, De Scorfidio's project, I think from the 90s, in digestion, that talks about the sort of power structures that are implemented inside of who sits around a table, who sits where, and who has the gaze towards what, and how to sort of like maybe start undermining that. I mean, there's obviously some sort of feminist ideology and so forth in there. And then there's another project, and maybe that would be helpful to start thinking about kind of the moment where you ended the project in terms of Pershing Square. What does that mean for the site? Are you going into the tabula rasa kind of ideology with your tabula or not? Like where are you positioning yourself in there? There's this piece by Andreas Ruby that he wrote about Vassal on tabula non rasa, sort of about urban contextualism. That I again, completely different project, completely different form. And I'm not saying that I don't, like, I really do love the models. But I do wonder if kind of what Brian started to allude to, like the cracks, the texture, how do you start changing and maybe mixing up the sort of power structures that are in place if you just put a ginormous table in there and somebody just sees it as a tiny, tiny little person, or where's that shift happening? In terms of the miniature project, it might be as much as just having a photo series of close-ups, right? Of just like a different kind of experiential experience, but starting to think about what it really means in terms of the hierarchical problems that you're starting to tackle with it, which has something to do with the beginning project, but ultimately, what does it mean to put a ginormous table that we can only see from the bottom, if that's the case? Or how can you start sort of in terms of access points and so forth, start to challenge that ideology?
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with all the comments. I want to quickly go back to your issue. There's a diagram you produced, the new organizational diagram that talks about the federal, the corporate, the private, and the public. I think that's a really powerful diagram that I'd love for you to start to actually tackle programmatically in some ways onto the site. And I think with all tables, at least from my perspective, tables want to have things on top of them. So I don't know if you want to start like tackling the top of this thing. For me, it relates so much to the current LACMA design. And I think, in my personal opinion, it's a bad thing. You have to be conscious about your thesis as a kind of time-specific project. And the fact that that's such a politically publicized current project in Los Angeles, I think it'll take away from your project in particular. But you're in a great spot, right? I mean, this is the first review, and it's really up to you to try and translate how you want to take these kind of miniatures and start to scale them up, whether it's you kind of take the imperfections of the model, the kind of messiness, or even the wood grain, and try to literally kind of build that one-to-one as a building. And you have to figure out how to resolve kind of material thickness through these kind of small-scaled material qualities, which could be interesting. Or you really look back at your research and start to dive into this thing programmatically and trying to integrate kind of public versus private. Think about program as far as who's occupying the space, if there's a government or if there's a kind of corporation that's in it. I think that'll really strengthen the project as you move forward, is starting to make more specific moves in line with the research. But overall, it's a super fascinating thesis, and I look forward to seeing where it goes in the future.
Thank you so much. Yeah, those were very great comments. Yeah.
Conclude and maybe summarize a couple of things. Christopher, I agree completely that you're kind of ready to really design this building. And to take a kind of cue from Brian's comment, I think it's really important to consider what it means to engage the landscape of this project. And it doesn't have to be literally landscape. I think what we've been talking about is kind of the infrastructure of actually placing something into the city. And for a monument to have this ability to actually integrate into the city, to bring people to the table, means not to consider things as tabula rasa, but to consider things as really fertile ground, like already present with history, with the messiness of politics, with with hordes of people and with the potential to protest and to actually come together and to have a voice. And so in many ways, that idea of this becoming a kind of public space and relating also to the infrastructure of the city, to the subway systems, to the parks, etc. This is something that, you know, a Rhino model or a miniature model freestanding cannot really tell the full story of a kind of urban proposal. So that's probably where you'll have to go next to unpack the idea of tabulation, the idea of a kind of urban mess that has to somehow engage and open up some of the things that seem a little bit more more enclosed by the idea of the format or the form of the table. Yeah. And I think Maya's point about scale is super important. Yeah. In that regard, because of course we see it from above as a model, but we see it from below as a building. So this is where you're going to really toggle between a kind of abstraction of the project and the experience of this as a kind of public space. Yeah. Okay.
Not to mess up the nice conversation, but it was always interesting when I was an assistant at the Anglemate, we always had kind of like the big heads of state of architecture in there. So it'd be like Cool House with Wolf Pricks, with Zaha, with, I mean, Hernan in the background, like smoking a cigar, you know, it had like lots of like big names. They all fought after, Wolf Pricks was very particular about where he sat at the table. You know, when they all came in beforehand, and they all were trying to get the same seat, which was in the back corner and not at the head of the table, just to the side of it. And they would discuss about, like, Wolf Pricks discussed about that. So I was wondering, when you talk about this, like how it works with the context, somebody like Wolf Pricks, who's very, like, it was very important for him to be the power head in the room, you know, like, I wonder if there's, like Maya was talking about this sort of idea of like, and then I mean, Zaha would have somebody actually bring a chair in for her because she wouldn't sit on the chairs that were at the thing, and then he'd sit it down and everybody would move, you know, like a big Austrian guy would carry in her chair, and then she'd come late and everybody would kind of about face, you know, so it was really interesting watching all these like sort of people working the room and then all wanting this like one chair when they walked in the right-hand corner. So I was just wondering, like, if there's, Maya, is it the head of the table that is the one that, I mean, that's like when you think about like family structures, but is that how it works in a board meeting and everywhere? Is that, you said you were studying this sort of a thing. It was a dumb question.
Yes.
Is there a spot?
No, I mean, of course it's the head of the table, and of course it's, I mean, it's like a sort of like, nuclear family structural.
Okay. And then, I was thinking like Last Supper with Jesus, he's in the middle, you know, I don't know where, that's why I'm wondering, but it's the head of the table. Okay.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Hi, everyone. My name is Vincent. I will share my screen.
Is this like the Biennale, Vincent, where everybody was dressed as a building?
Yes, I am wearing a fascinator of my project. Okay, so that was just a brief, I think, just interlude. But the title of my project right now is Walk This Way. It's kind of a cheeky play on the Run DMC song, which is a cover of the Aerosmith song. My project is a community center, so I thought that the title Walk This Way would be relevant, as well as the inclusion of just like pop and pop culture into my project as a place of common ground to like begin discussion. So the project here, simply stated, is a community center in the city of Rosemead. The site is a large ex-LA auto auction site, so it's a large parking lot. It's around 650,000 square feet. I'm thinking of designing a series of large roof structures, possibly made of CLT. The program requirements will be pools, meeting rooms, change rooms, libraries, communal program elements that would exist on the ground. And I think that the idea of like recreation as a space for healing and action is important in terms of the theoretical claim, as well as a site for like protests that we've seen this past month. I think that the division between like mental recreation in libraries and physical recreation in like the pools and gyms is something that I could maybe bring together in this building. In the roof, there'd be a circulation for maintenance space. For my thesis prep, I also, once again, titled my thesis after a song. It was called Oops, I Did It Again. And this was more of a research onto the history of pools and how they came to be in America, as well as ways that community exists both online and not just from the idea of the communitas, which is the shared ground. These are like, I think, the formal sensibilities I have from my time at SCI-Arc, as well as my, I think, obsession with like line work and drawings, specifically from like plan view. And the current work environment, this is on the Miro board. Also, if you go to the Miro board, you can see the link to this presentation. These are just some writings. So these are a series of drawings I made of the downtown YMCA of the pool, just as a examination of what exists currently. And then situating the pool between the public beach and then the private pool in LA. And more drawings of like possible program elements in the building under these roofs, which is playgrounds and these possible change rooms. And the site itself in Rosemead, of course, is not, I think, just a like large parking lot, but it has a rich history, especially with the Quiche native tribes that existed before the Spanish invasion, which actually on the website of Rosemead, the city itself doesn't recognize at all. It kind of just talks about settlers moving into the space and seeing the land as like fertile ground for agriculture. So the relationship from this site to the water and the river is quite important. And now what sits on the ground now is a domestic site. So suburbs that, according to estimates from last year, mainly make up of an Asian American descent or Asian descent or Hispanic Latino descent. The additions of those two populations roughly make up 90% of the population of the site, as well as the notable people, Bob Mackey and Taboo from Black Eyed Peas is from there. So the site itself is up for redevelopment by the city. So the Garvey Avenue, which is the large street in front, has been set for, I think, improvements. From the plan itself, they want to build a dog park as well as increase youth programs, as well as development of the splash zone. Splash zone is currently the water park that's right nearby. They want to expand that. This is the, I think, site assessment from the city plan, as well as the zoning laws, as well as these are all the sites that the cities are considering for redevelopment. So this was a format test of ways I could produce, I think, techniques of visualizing the site. This is before I tried to make it walk, W-O-K, before walk. But this is a splash zone, this is the site itself. So you can see it's surrounded by houses mostly. However, there's this strip of the street right here, the Garvey Avenue strip, which is, I think, quite accessible by public transit, as well as over here you have the Alhambra Wash, which is part of a tributary from the LA River. That's the site, and this is the site currently. It's an abandoned site of parking lots, as well as there's currently one cigarette store that's in the middle of the street. So these are maybe more towards the techniques that allowed me to produce form. So drawing the site and scanning the site, a technique that I think has been pretty productive for me. On the right, I've tried scanning with really wobbly hands. So it wasn't a digital manipulation at all, but just on the scanner, playing with techniques of moving the paper, as well as taping over the ink cartridges in my printer. These are up close images of those, as well as printing on trace paper and folding trace paper, as well as like figuring out the actual speeds of which I need to print on the trace paper, or else it will smudge, as well as just testing out ways of like scanning, like the YMCA pool schedule, or just plastic wrap. So the grids I've come up with, I think, was just a way to produce form, and folding as a way of producing these roof types. So these are just material samples of the folding paper techniques, which I've then played with the edge conditions of these papers. So using scissors and playing with trimming as a way of maybe possibly suggesting some three-dimensional section of a material, or just simply a program distribution. These are the pieces. And then kind of being quite rigid in Rhino and actually calculating these folds. And then the output was, for my miniature model, was, I think, a display of like the technique. I think that the roof condition was quite defined in the miniature model. However, I think the ground is still a little unconsidered on my end. And I think that that's my next steps, is figuring out how to lay out the change rooms and the transition from entrance onto the site through the change rooms to the pools. But these are the little techniques that I did, like layering the museum board over the paper.
Vincent, let's open it up to discussion. We have 10 minutes left.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I can show them all.
I can start. Vincent, this is a really fun presentation. I really love the intro and the setup of the project. I think the site is really thoughtful. I do. I mean, there's a lot of conversation about the history of public pools, especially in New York and Philadelphia. And considering everything that's going on right now, you might want to. I agree with you. I think the ideas of ground, so how to start to understanding how do you operate in something that is essentially monumental because of the monument, the miniature monument that you've been doing, and I really love the really thoughtful drawings of, you didn't call it seams, but I would call it seams. What do you call them? Edges. I would call them seams, because that means they're actually ways of going in, which might be a possibility for you to start thinking about creases and seams on a different level, and what does that mean in terms of program or how one operates and moves through that, how it ties back into the city and into your site, because ultimately, I mean, the sort of painful history of the public pool and segregation, right, was just A plus B, right? So I do love and find it courageous that you're tackling that and tackling it with all the sort of energy that you put into it. So I really truly believe that you will have an amazing project. I wouldn't just leave it out, and while I truly believe you can also make an amazing drawing project out of it, I would challenge you to also tie that, sort of fold that back into the project. While, I mean, yes, it could also be an amazing just scanner, drawing, scanner kind of process and destabilization project in that sense, in terms of what it can do for you and in terms of representation. But I think, especially in this time and age that we're living through, I think it's important to start to understand that, and start to understand what a seam is in that architecture, in that negotiation.
Vincent, I really like the hat.
Thank you.
I think it fits with the
Yes.
presentation in some ways. So it's, for some reason, thesis tends to be a very exciting but also difficult time in one's architectural career. I think one of it has to do with this idea of editing, or trying to figure out what needs to be added to start to connect the dots, or to have a kind of cohesive body of work. So like one question I have for you, you start to take, let's say, screenshots of your apartment, or you start to speak about the kind of analog technique of you as the author kind of analog kind of moving the scan, or we have screenshots of your desktop. But then we also have this conversation about TikTok and pop cultural kind of references and program. And I'm wondering, is the thesis more about a kind of diary or representation of you throughout the entire kind of summer, the kind of aggregation of all these things? Or do you really want to land on a kind of program and building site-specific plan sections? Because I think you have to make that decision sooner than later. For me, the most exciting thing for the project is the technique that you've created with the scans and the folding. And especially when I start to look at the kind of detail, the layering of the model, I think there's some really rich moments that you could turn into a thesis, right? Like that could be the thesis, and then you could work on it and resolve it through the design of a project somewhere in LA. But it just seems like there's a lot of things happening simultaneously. And I wanted to know if that's intentional or if it's just a kind of subconscious thing that's happening throughout this summer.
I think it's intentional for me. I think just as a way to document for myself and for my advisor and for my friends to show a little bit, be more transparent with the way I'm working. I think that in terms of packaging it as a project with plans and sections, I think that that will also exist. But I think that on the platform of Miro, I see it, and I think even these informal Zoom presentations, I think that I'd rather be a little bit more rough, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that. That's what I wanted you to say. So I would just say, as you move forward throughout the summer, you should really consider how you want to present the final thesis, whether that's through multiple platforms or film or some type of performance or some type of archive. Really consider the way in which you want to present the thesis, just as much as you want to consider the aesthetic qualities, the representation of it as well.
Yeah, I didn't know I was going to speak so much. I realized I had so many things to say. So I think just tightening my argument as well.
I mean, both Maya and Ryan are alluding to this, that when you have a kind of pop sensibility on the one hand and a very just kind of beautifully crafted form on the other, how do you collapse them literally into one building so that it's not, so you're not kind of jumping back and forth between different voices or values, but you're able to incorporate. And I think that, you know, that even the seam of the scissor, of the kind of playful kid's scissor, begins to do that. There's a kind of nonchalance, I guess, or just some sort of like very pop familiar tone to the model. I wonder where it happens more and more often, so that you don't have to always place Britney Spears in front of the building, but she somehow gets incorporated into the detailing. And in many ways, once you begin to work with CLT, with the material that's very specific, you can probably start designing some of these things, some of these details.
Hey, Vincent, like the presentation. It's very kind of, you're very, I commend you on the sort of, let's say, I would say bravery. I mean, you can probably see by me, I put myself in front of a window so that I'm black. Like, you can't see my face because I'm an insecure person, you know, and you have a hat on top of your head, and I can see that you have cornflakes behind you, you know, you're very, like, you know, and you're saying, like, walk this way, you know, I love it. I think that it's like a sort of great project. It's like outgoing. I love that you're trying to infuse pop. You know, I'm sticking to the sort of one image that you had that you quickly went through, which was the the David Hockney photo that you had of the pool. And I'm thinking of Hockney's work, also like with a series of pools, and also other images of Hockney, which is the sort of idea of, you know, when you were sort of doing let's say a contemporary version of Hockney, probably something that he would be doing where you're glitching the phone by holding it like this. But I'm thinking of his series of photographs where he would take, you know, a series of 100 photographs and kind of collage them together to make a new image. He even has them of pools, right, where he takes multiple photos of people jumping in at different times, where now we start to play with like multiple figures, but it's still kept within a grid. So there's like interesting plays, I think. So for me, I would continue, and I even remember watching a Hockney documentary, you know, where it's him driving in his like convertible Mercedes-Benz through Los Angeles, and he puts in like home speakers in the back seat, and he blasts music, and he has a choreograph through like his drive that he takes at like 5 o'clock every day. So, you know, like when he comes around the corner, like, you know, large like symphony breaks out. And I'm wondering if there's a way that you can sort of also, with this sort of walk this way, if you can sort of choreograph a way or a movement through your project, let's say, and that choreography, I think you could then play into the idea of patterning. And I mean, patterning is in like clothes making. I don't know how they still make clothes. I'm having to draw from my only experience of watching way too much Project Runway and my mother. So, you know, that's pretty much all I know about. But my mother had these, I don't know if they still make it, but this like almost like trace paper. And then she had those quilting shears that you had, and then they made quilts. And I was trying to connect the idea of like quilts to Hockney in a way, of like these sort of historic kind of connections that you have this sort of, because his could almost be like a series of photographs of the same thing with these sort of quilting edges. I guess it's so that the fabric didn't fray, correct, is the idea of these sort of large quilting. So that you're playing with these sort of seams and unseaming projects and the sort of suture that would go through. I mean, suture using a word that Maya and I, that was in like a brief that we were given last year. But, you know, how you start to like fold, and I love this sort of, even because I'm thinking that the pattern isn't so clear, right? Like we're taking always in architecture, we're taking squares and cutting them. But if like, when I'm thinking of clothing, like the figure isn't a cube, right? So they're more interesting sort of patterns that start to overlap the way that you have to like kind of fold, you actually do it like inside out, right? And you sew it and then turn it inside out. There's a lot of things I think to keep going in. I mean, I'm even thinking of like costume design, because you went with the pop reference. So I think that there's a way of pulling in, I think you said something about Britney Spears even, right? I mean, in one case, she's like, her probably most famous thing, I'm thinking, is she's like wearing a snake. I don't know that much about, but you know, like it's even like another figure on figure with that sort of understanding. And even like that sort of snake being like alive, you know, and like the skin of that and how that even works. So I think that you have tons of information. I would just try to like boil it down into like sort of one simple understanding of, I mean, I like that you're bringing in the Biennale for the postmodernist, sort of how you're wearing your building. So I think that it's all there. I think it's just missing one connection, and maybe it's just, I think you need to go further into like Hockney. That's my only, and like study his work a little bit more. I mean, Enrique Moraes did a wonderful series of collage in the same way but it would like melt and then go into a piece. Because I think that there's a way of combining your sort of technique with the sort of old Hockney collage as well. I'm looking at some of the images while we're speaking that I think really lend to. I mean, I know you already had it in your piece, but that's the way I think you can go through. So the choreography, the choreography of the presentation of Walk This Way, I guess, the choreography of how you're choreographing the photography, the experience of how you go through, and then the sort of patterning, and patterning not as in like, I don't mean like hatch or like the square from that kind of pattern. I'm meaning like the seams, like if I were to undo my shirt, you know, like this new kind of like figure that becomes a t-shirt as well.
It's such a great point, Brian. And I also kind of put a little link to a very recent Hockney painting, like literally painting marks onto the pool. And I think, Vincent, that's just an amazing reference that that I think flashes through. So that's something to look forward to. Great place to be right now. So I really think it's going to be a building that you're designing, but it has to incorporate all of the stuff that we've been talking about.
Yeah, this is really helpful. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Amanda, you're up.
Yeah.
And sorry, we're kind of like, we keep posting in the notes, time. So we're going to try to keep us on time as much as possible.
Can you see the screen? Yeah, great. So this thesis is asking this really fundamental question of what it is we're dealing with when we're dealing with interior space. So we know that our relationship to comfort and interiors has changed, and we're asking what it means to be comfortable in one's own home and what it means to reconfigure one's home at this time. So this kind of analysis of the interior is something that is rarely accurately performed in the studio setting. And so here the design of the domestic interior becomes kind of like an idealized and controlled version of the home office. So a laboratory space in which to present this kind of project of AAE, or something like analytic, aestheticized environmentalism, really as a way of kind of pushing the project and addressing this idea of comfort in the interior. And really contending that architecture is not just the building, but it's this complex relationship between the environment and bodies and built objects. So the miniature model for me has really been a miniature version of my working space. So here are some of the things that I've kind of been acquiring in that pursuit. The background, the tripod, the light, the fan, and the concrete stepping stone. And kind of thinking of ways that we kind of perform within our spaces to arrange these objects within the home office now. And then also kind of like contrasting the way that these technological apparatuses have entered the domestic sphere with kind of more traditional comfort aesthetics. So things which are maybe soft or light or flimsy. You can kind of see in the paper dolls here, which are things that I've been looking at and have also made their way into the miniature model. So the working space itself as the site of this investigation has been really important for me. So here are kind of just some images of my space which show maybe these juxtapositions between soft and hard or office and domestic within the interior. So going forward for the next month, I've made myself a kind of shooting schedule. So 13 vignettes with 13 apparatuses or appliances that are kind of documented in a way where they interact with themselves and with one another, with the bodies and with the architectural space, as a way of kind of presenting this alternative project of environmental systems and rendering these environmental aesthetics. So here are some of kind of like a visualization of the tools that I'm working with. And all the tools had to be chosen from a selection of things which appeared in the studio space at SCI-Arc in a kind of pre-COVID world. So for example, not the oven, but the microwave. And then similarly, the way that I'm kind of pushing this idea of the domestic being inverted from a space of consumption to a site of production, there's this inversion that I'm playing within the image making process. So these kind of experiments that we see here of the act of rendering in real time. So the kind of light as a way of rendering light as being this first step in the design process. And then afterwards, this practice of annotation as a way of making sense of the world and making sense of the interior and doing this project of analyzing the environment and the interior. So we have, like, I've been looking at video game aesthetics a lot, and I think they're really successful, like, as an interface, as a way of presenting a lot of different kinds of information in one screen, in one frame, as the mise en scène. So we have like date and temperature, product information from the light, the kind of mapping or plan view that shows the character moving around the space, kind of information of the body that's participating, so metabolic rates and things like that. And then the live chat as a kind of like running stream of what's being presented in the project. Yeah, thank you.
Amanda, can I ask you the green screen, the green background in your project? Is that part of the scene?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
I mean, I think so too. You didn't really talk about it. I mean, I also think so because my partner is writing this paper on green screens and urban spaces, so we've been talking about that a lot. But yeah, I do think they're and this ultimately has also something to do with kind of where you ended, right? The hyper reality of gaming environments, or maybe more something in the direction of avatars, where what is real, or the layered realities that we're creating and we're moving through creates actually a different or another environment for us, especially right now. So I wonder if it's about, yeah, not only the players, but also where they're positioned inside of out of that scene that you're operating in. Like there were certain moments where you started playing between background and foreground and started playing with ideas of distance and scale inside of that. And I do wonder if you're starting to think about CGI and gaming environments, and what does that mean for an architecture, or how an architect would tackle that problem. If you want to dive a little bit deeper into that in particular.
Yeah, I think definitely to the first point, like this idea of it's not only the players and it's not only the positioning, but it's kind of the interaction between these things for sure. In terms of the comment about CGI, I don't think it's something that I'd really thought of up to this point, but maybe something to think about moving forward.
Maybe.
Yeah.
I guess just building onto that, I mean, it would be interesting, I agree with Maya, to maybe look at alternative modes of representation, whether it would be CG. It seems like that's, like you said, wasn't something you were considering. For me, it's, at least right now, there's a kind of DIY or kind of arts and crafts, like homes, arts and crafts, in the way that you're translating your appliances into these kind of models, right? And then you're starting to do kind of stop motion or kind of vignettes of how to represent these things. And so if it's about, I think, did you say 15 vignettes?
Right now it's 13, but 13. I mean, I think it's flexible.
But I think trying to challenge new forms of representation is probably the most important thing for you to consider as you move forward, because it seems as though you have a kind of clear understanding of your work and your kind of thesis interests. But I would say, in addition to the vignettes, I would encourage you to write about the work, because this work needs a kind of close reading to some extent, because it's such an everyday object, right? We all take for granted the kind of microwave or the printer, but if you can communicate to us in a different way how we can start to understand those things in relationship to our own environments, I think that would be really helpful. I'm not saying you have to go and write a book or something, but I think writing about these things would be really beneficial for you. And then the third thing, which is the kind of fashion thing or the fabric, the kind of decorative nature of it, there's a certain sensibility to those precedents. And I'd love to see how you want to maybe start to introduce that into your own thesis, and into your own, let's say, final vignettes in some ways. But really interesting process. And it seems like the interior is an important subject, especially today, right? I have to commend you on taking on such a relevant topic, but it's also very challenging. So it'll be exciting to see where all this goes.
Thank you.
Amanda, so I think I kept, when you were showing images, kind of going down one image, and I think I kind of, to be honest, I think I got lost of what your sort of very core idea is, because I would see like an image of a green screen, I'd see a microwave, and I kept kind of jumping around and kind of trying to finish your project in my own head and not really, I think I lost what, can you, in like the thesis format, when I taught that for many years, I would love it. And I know it's really difficult, but there is, maybe you said it, but is there a one sentence sort of way of boiling down the topic into like one sentence and just maybe repeat? Because I think I got lost somewhere. I understand what they're all saying.
I've been struggling with the one sentence, but I realize how important it is. I mean, I think right now, if I were trying to like really simplify it, it's doing this project in the domestic space of AAE, or analytic aestheticized environmentalism, but also the impact of that is to argue for this idea that architecture isn't just buildings, it's buildings and built objects plus people plus environments. There is more beyond that, but that's pretty like central.
That's pretty good. That was actually very good. The question is then, I guess, then you're also looking at virtual. Is that the idea of the green screens? Then it's like sort of a virtual environment on top of that?
I think so. I mean, I think the green screen, since we started working remotely, has just been like this odd fixture that a lot of people have been taking on as a way of attaining some other goal, but it's so interesting in and of itself, I think. I've set up a working space in my parents' garage, and it seemed like the first thing to get was this backdrop with these like different colors of muslin that you can throw over them. So it's there in the space right now. But
I understand. That's kind of the tabula rasa to talk about, like maybe an overall arc that's maybe happening. That's actually performing that sort of like clean slate to whatever room or to whatever idea that you're having. And, you know, it might be off topic, or it might be, but, you know, I don't know if you saw it, but it was, I haven't seen the show, but it's The Mandalorian, which was like the Star Wars show. But it was actually, they didn't use green screens in that show. It was like this really interesting, they actually were like in a circular LED screen. So it's actually like, because the problem, I guess, with green screen is that it actually washes green onto whatever the object is. So it's actually like a live updating sort of object. And I don't know if that also kind of could play, because that was like the next step within the green screen. The green screen's kind of, you know, 1980s, 1990s technology. This sort of like live update. You'll be able to see it if you use YouTube. It's pretty interesting. And then it even asks, even then inside of there, we'll do a small green screen behind, like it will silhouette out the figure of whatever's happening and have a live screen, and then with like the sort of tracking dots that are on there too. I think that might be interesting as well within the sort of idea of green screen, is the sort of pinpoints of like locators that would happen within your objects on that, so that you could actually like track other things on top of it, and that might help give another layer. But you know, I think to zoom out, I think that you have, I guess, a lot of really great ideas. It's just at the point, like you said, like I think even when you just said that one sentence, it became a lot clearer. And I think that I would keep pushing on that, get something really the clear idea, simple, and then like move outward from there, I guess. That's just my 2 cents. I know it's foggy. I feel like in 1 week we could have another review, and then it would really be like we could knock it out. But maybe that was just me. I got a little lost.
No, not at all. I actually, Brian, I really like the fact that you asked and challenged Amanda to kind of bring it back to this sentence. And I was thinking, as Ryan, you were speaking, that do you remember how you worked on One Night Stand LA, where architects kind of took over one motel in Los Angeles, and everybody had a motel room in order to put together an installation? And I mean, of course you remember, you kind of were part of this. I wonder if you can speak to this a little bit, because I have a feeling, Amanda, that you're doing something similar in that you're taking over a domestic environment, but you're infusing it with all kinds of technologies and ways in which you're working, and kind of disclosing and visualizing and making it kind of present, all the while talking about the comfort of the interior. And somehow, I think a lot of those projects that came out of the motel kind of collections dealt with maybe similar difficulties of like working around the bed or working against the window frame, and working in kind of this kind of real size and bodies of just very confined spaces, and opening them up to architectural projects.
Yeah, and Amanda, if you want to take this on in a kind of literal way, you could always use your house or your apartment, right? As opposed to having a site-specific environment. The benefit of the motel room was that it was cheap, so we could rent it out for a night. But they were all very repetitive. They were basically the same typology for every single room. But for your thesis, you have to make a decision. Do you want 13 different projects, or do you want one project represented in 13 different ways? And maybe this goes back to the green screen comment, or the kind of radial spherical green screen comment. But it's up to you how you want to kind of conclude the research. And these are all suggestions, but I think you probably know this project better than anyone else. And I would definitely encourage you to go with your gut on this as much as possible.
Yeah, those are all great comments. I mean, just to that last point, as it is now, I've set up my workspace to like my laboratory and my parents' garage. So it's like very much sited in this one domestic space. And I think there is something powerful in being able to that directly interact with what you're working on that I like. Yeah.
American Startup, right? Is the garage.
Yeah.
There was a great commercial, like if you years ago that showed like all the famous garages around America, like all the like Apple and all these things that started out in the garage. It's these like famous sort of iconic spots in America.
Amazing.
That's a good point.
Because every big company, I guess, kind of came from a garage, like, or especially the Facebook era or the computer world.
Yeah, that's great.
I want to shout out to Marika Trotter, who just joined us. Hi, Marika. Like Eric, she's been working with a lot of students throughout thesis prep and thesis, so it's really lovely to see you jump into our Zoom.
Yes, I had the luxury of being able to float today, so I'm very glad to be joining you guys.
To really take over this garage. And I think you need to go a little bit wild before you can really tame and edit down. And I love the comment that, try 13 things in one place versus, one thing in 13 places. How do you begin to change out backgrounds, foregrounds, middle grounds, and really put together a game about your project, which is what you've been kind of talking about all along. So I think you need to kind of aggressively just like move in and just go for it.
Yeah, thank you.
Max, we're passing the mic to you.
Let's do it. Great job, everyone, so far. I'm going to try sharing this and make sure that I can flip through. Is everyone seeing that change? Yes? Great.
Yes.
So, hi, my name is Max. This piece is called Resisting Omnipresent Jewels of Doom. I'm going to speak for 5.5 minutes, and I ask that you please hold all questions and comments for the end, barring any technical difficulties. The presentation is going to start slow and pick up speed as we go. My thesis imagines a novel form of urbanism that reintroduces a seemingly obsolete technology, life with a horse. I'm learning from the Compton Cowboys, who've shared their knowledge from a community that stands strong against challenge through our city's history. The modern cowboys employ a regime of care and maintenance, where their relationship with horses serves to ameliorate the current moment in time, defined by industrial extraction. Urban equestrianism, or equestrian urbanism, proposes that the tool for remediation of urban strife is the horse. I don't know exactly what to say about these first 3 images, but I made them as a way to start working and as a container for some ideas. While we look at them, I'll read an excerpt from a note that I wrote myself in my iPhone over the few months before starting at SCI-Arc. I prefer to see the architect as a guide, not the actor. It's a question of how to help in a society whose basis is fundamentally flawed. How can I join the collective mission to empower non-Western and non-white peoples and support competition on an economic niveau without implying encouragement of a society based on money and exploitation? Intentions. 1, give the people the agency to destroy dependence and so strip the oppressor of power. 2, redefine our subsistence on financial success, i.e. happiness to be something like happy, i.e. contentment to be physical and emotional, end quote. This is a scan of a patent drawing of the winner, a very economically efficient type of barbed wire. It was used to separate the rangeland of the American West into mostly private parcels in the 19th century. Barbed wire fencing keeps migratory people and animals from crossing into pasture land of established farms, eliminating the previously held concept of common land. Here's a scan of a surveyor's drawing of Los Angeles in 1849, 1 year before its incorporation and 2 years before the first Anglo-American was born here. North of Main Street are the city's rectangular blocks mingling with the land's varying topography. You'll see notations for farmland stretching south of Main Street. This is a screenshot of Google Maps highlighting all stables within reasonable distance of downtown. Well, this is all of the Walmarts within the same distance. I've selected this one down here. Let's get a better color. You get the point. I selected this one down here to zoom in on. This view serves to show my 3 sites. So we have site 1, the Walmart, site 2, this little dot, And site 3 is the Alameda corridor running up to downtown. Here's an isolated view in a format that makes it a little easier to see scale of the sites. Again, we have site 1 is the Walmart, the largest one. Site 2 is nestled in the neighborhood here. It's the historical site of the Eagle Tree. And then the Alameda corridor is represented by these collection of lines here on the side. For the largest, most intensive building, the stable, we'll use the site of the Walmart Supercenter. A stable on a site of this size could house many dozen horses. The historical site of the Eagle Tree will be the hitching post. This is the rider's temporary stopping place. The trail will be located along an existing urban infrastructure project, the trench known as the Alameda Corridor. This is the downtown ways artery for containers of goods continuing by land from the city's port in San Pedro. Uninterrupted, below-grade tracks stretch 30 miles through the city, 10 of them underground. Cars are double stacked with 40-foot containers. Trains are 1.5 miles long, with only an engineer on either end. And here's today's subject, the miniature model. At the top edge of the subject here is a two-sided billboard with drawings on it. The left side is a basswood construction that represents a stable, and the bottom is a post hitched with a golden horse. The right side is another 3D printed horse, glued, sanded, and painted to look like a palomino walking over the center of the model, which is bare earth. Nominally 1 foot by 1 foot by 1 inch thick, the 20-pound urethane foam was cut, sanded, and painted, particularly in the suggested paths and lounging areas. Grass-like foam is glued on the edges of any fixed objects and in places where horses would not be likely to graze. Corrugated cardboard with one side peeled off mimics steel roofing that might be used on a barn. The billboard works as a nice backdrop for the scene. At this angle, we can see bedding from the hayloft above covering the floor of the stall. Right outside the stall, planks of wood have been laid on the ground next to the barn's wall, as if resting until they're picked up again to resume some unknown project. The chosen material's dimension allows posts to double each other from certain views. Our palomino on the right was painted very lightly from a distance of a couple feet with textured stone-colored Rust-Oleum. This manner of construction does really interesting things with light, as gradients of shadow and color wash over the basswood and the voids. I'm not sure just what this is. It could be a salt lick or a well covering or a bin for feed. It was just an incense holder before making its transition. Thank you.
So Max, what kinds of feedback would you find most useful? Like where are you thinking about going next, and how can we advise you best?
Totally. So I am basically at the point of designing these three, whatever is going to go on these three sites that I've outlined. And so I've kind of sort of, taken a shot at designing this, and I don't know exactly if I've hit the target or what, but this was just designing on the fly. So yeah, I mean, I really have presented my message here today, so I think giving some feedback on the message could be great, and any advice you might have on doing a, what's suggested to be a real project in a real community, blah, blah, blah. Not something totally alienated, whatever, but also on how to design spaces like this would be really helpful. Yeah.
So I note the kind of écriture blanche style of the presentation, where every little thing is described in detail, right? You know what I'm talking about, that kind of that famous method of post-structuralist writing, where like you talk about the moment that the knife begins to cut through the tomato skin, and then you feel the little tension, and then it goes to the next layer of flesh, and then you've got the burst of the sea. Like every little thing is described. And I wonder, actually, I'm really curious to see how you can translate that kind of attention to the mundane production of space into what would be an exceptional disruption to the status quo, right? And I think you're onto something super weird and powerful. If you can figure out how to translate that into a design methodology going forward. Like, I don't think you can stay, right now it feels like you're at the level of analogy where you're showing us the kind of thing you want to do in architecture through almost a kind of art performance and a literary performance. And now you're going to have to take a leap, it seems to me, into the stuff of architecture and figure out what the analog would be in architecture. Because it won't, I don't think it'll do justice to the kind of radical a coolness of your idea, which I think is awesome, I should say, if you keep it at the level of the diorama, let's say. You've got to figure out how to make the diorama work at the architectural scale. Like, it would be amazing to somehow put the diorama into the full scale of the city, and to kind of shock people with coming across something that seems like it's a little bit of the earth that's been cored out and separated, like a total hyper real parafiction, yeah, but then presented as a fantasy, but as a very, very real fantasy with its own reality, with its own kind of like whatever the stone, the faux stone finish would be at full scale, if you like, ruthlessly presented, so that you would literally go from the kind of the city as we know it, with its scale and with its smells and its noises and its kind of capitalist logic, all that stuff. And then you would step foot onto your site, onto your project site, and literally feel like you are one of those little 3D printed figurines. So that, I think, is going to be a super exciting challenge. And I would encourage you to get down to like the level of how you would detail it, what the finishes would be, what the how you would conceal the fasteners or make the fasteners seem as though they were model scale fasteners, like all that stuff. How you would get the kind of 3D print grit into the full scale world. I think that could be just magical and also shocking and super cool.
I'll jump in just for a minute, Marika, because that was I think your comment is really parallels conversations that we've been having in our group, and with Max in particular, about really spending this month designing the buildings. I mean, we've spent time up to this point setting up the project, and now that Max is working on a urban stable, we know what it is as a program. And so in a way, all of the comments about the kind of thinking about the billboard as architecture, thinking about the details of the model as they pertain to the building, those are exactly the comments that I think would be super important today. Right, Max?
Totally. Super helpful, Marika. Thank you.
Yeah, if I can jump in and kind of echo the comments that Shirley gave. Also, I can't stop but stare at the, you have a model of the Strata Zero car behind you. I don't know where you got that, but that's pretty awesome, I have to say. No, the Marika or America. I've never met you, but
it's Marika.
Marika, right? That model of the car is like a dream car since I was a kid, or the model of it. Cool. Yeah, I don't know if you mentioned
I'll pass your enthusiasm on to Tom Wiscombe, who's
oh, it's somebody else's. Oh, okay. I didn't. Yeah, cool toy. You know, I don't know if you mentioned it already, but Max, but I think that like the sort of, let's say you're not learning from Vegas. I don't know if you spoke about learning from Las Vegas and the idea of Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown and their sort of study on that. I think that was kind of rooted in the idea of figure ground. They were also studying like Piranesi and these kind of studies on the city, but they did it on Vegas, and they were learning from the billboard and how that affects. And so I think Venturi is a good precedent for you to study also the Robert Venturi NFL Museum, which is also just a giant billboard that says "I am not a demon." I think this sort of text, or maybe that was also just on the book, but I think that would be a good kind of case study to begin, where you start to study using kind of like, let's say, typical figure ground like studies or Piranesi studies on the city, and how this sort of how this new topology would like kind of emerge from your studies of, to get back to, I mean, the idea of the billboard, and then I guess the billboard structure, the billboard typology, you're then trying to infuse with the idea of the cowboy. Is that correct, Max? The discussion of the cowboy, and then it moved into the billboard.
Not exactly the cowboy.
Oh, okay.
I just want to, I actually would want to maybe go against what Brian said a little bit. I think this is 100% not a learning from Las Vegas project, which is about kind of finding some charm in the mundane of the city. This is a much more radical proposal that has to do with rejecting the city as we know it, and its logics and its consumer processes, and the kind of ordinary vernacular that it implies, and substituting another one instead that would have nothing to do, actually, with the elevation of vernacular that was part of that project.
Yeah, I would agree with Marika on this one, and so I've been advising it. So I could say from that experience that this is more like a kind of Marxist situationist project and not a semiotics one. That the stables are not even actually the core from in my mind of this. It's the fact that the stables enact a network, in this case of like basically like Black equestrian people like covering huge amounts of territory in the city, in kind of logics that can stand against maybe what the kind of occupation of public space and ordinary space is. That the kind of trail and the hitch are absolutely necessary because it's not confined to the stables, right? It's reaching across vast swaths of the city. This kind of presence of an empowered character on a horse, which a historic presence, and one that already exists in LA, but one that maybe thought through in terms of kind of urban kind of intervention of changing what's possible to come across in ordinary life.
Oh, guys, that makes me realize something about your project, Max, which is, and I'm really grateful to actually Brian for bringing up learning from Las Vegas, because now it gives me something to ping against. Because one thing that Venturi never considered in that seems to be maybe one of the key points of design for you, which is the ground itself. Like the ground is going to be this intensely designed stratum for you, I think, which is exactly what's missing from all of those photos of the Vegas Strip and the surrounding vernacular. It's always shot up. You know, they have very little way to understand that kind of the capitalist surface. I think it's interesting. I think it's decolonizing architecture that that presented the idea really compellingly, that there's this one layer of the urban landscape that contains an incredible concentration of power, and that is that paved surface, just that foot of concrete and asphalt and whatever, even before you get down to the infrastructure. And if you could figure out how to really own the ground in this project, I think it could be so transformative and so powerful. Sorry, I'm going to stop.
But it's such an important comment, because one thing that, and I don't know if it's particular, Max, to your project, but it's like really for a lot of students in the Summers group, is that we've been working so much with infrastructural questions and with urban questions and political questions. And so, of course, the design of a building is something that we're kind of expert at talking and thinking through, but it's really all the infrastructure surrounding this particular program that will make the difference in the city. And it's exactly the overlay of this 19th century map, and this is something we've talked about on Monday, onto the current fabric of the city that will kind of unpack some of the sidewalks and walkways and bike lanes and what have you, so that you're kind of adding to the to the landscape of the city. As much as you're adding buildings, you're adding infrastructure. Max, thank you so much. Thanks to everybody for your comments. I think you're in a good place to really figure it out now and work on it. I see that we're joined by Ben Weisgall. Hi, Ben.
Hello. Hi, everybody.
Hi, Ben.
Just a very short introduction. Ben is also an alum of SCI-Arc and finished 2019. And he has been an instructor in some of the studios this semester with Andrew Zago. So a lot of the students in this room have been working with Ben. So I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you.
You're a friend of very many of us. Okay, I pass the mic.
Good morning, everybody. I think those last comments are actually a pretty good segue into my project. I think Max and I are pretty close in some of the issues that we're looking at, so that's great. Good morning. I'll just jump into sharing my screen. So to start off with, I'll say that I'm designing a dance conservatory as a network of spaces that rethink public space in the city. And they're designed to really come up close and in tension with some of the existing structural monuments that are in Los Angeles specifically. And now I'd like to tell you why. The story starts with a preoccupation of looking at monuments or iconic buildings from the backside, kind of like if you were to look at the back of a famous person's head and to think about the inattention or the aesthetics and some of the strange spaces that are produced by bringing in a monumental building into the world. Kind of the leftover marginal spaces have been something that has really interested me as both an urban condition and as an aesthetic proposition. So moving more specifically to Los Angeles, you can start to think about buildings like the Disney Concert Hall, which is obviously an extremely iconic example. But then you also can keep moving to other conditions where it's not so standalone, and there's surfaces that are produced between two iconic buildings, and then the introduction of a large infrastructural project that separates them, and you start to think about some of the spaces that exist between these conditions. But then you also need to start thinking about like what it actually is a monument in a city. And so you get closer to a site like this, which is just south of Chinatown, just southeast of downtown. It's an area bordered by the Union Station rail line up here, the Los Angeles River infrastructure down here, and the 101 freeway. And you have buildings here like the Twin Towers Correctional Facility, which is the world's largest jail. You have the Irwin C. Piper Technical Center, which is the world's largest rooftop heliport and houses the Los Angeles PD Air Division, which has more helicopters than any other major city by a large margin. But it also has these fascinating backsides to them and these quiet streets that you might not expect to encounter in the city. And then you also have blocks of bail bond services and retaining walls that have their own aesthetic qualities to them, but they also are these subdued, backgrounded support networks that are very much in relationship to those other monuments and define part of the infrastructural urban network here. And so I'm thinking through these spaces and I'm thinking about alternatives. And just recently I watched this documentary, I'm sure many people are familiar with it, The 13th by Ava DuVernay. And there was a moment in this documentary where they're talking about the prison cells and how there was this disbelief that this sort of built condition could occur within our country, and it was something that was designed by architects. And that made me start to think about what are some alternatives to these spaces that can be built in these spaces or built up very close in tension to these spaces, and what might a programmatic element be that would bring tension there. And so I'm starting to think about like movement and Black bodies in space. And it makes me think of these music videos, specifically this one from Chaka Khan's Like Sugar, where they're dancing in the same infrastructural no man's lands that I've been looking at. And so it really seemed like a powerful thing to use dance and to use some of these other more positive elements up against these prisons and bail bonds and LAPD Air Division massive heliports as a way of bringing a new public space into these areas. And so the question comes out is, how do you start documenting these from another perspective other than from the satellite? And so I went down on my bicycle and just started taking these videos of the various surfaces here that really interested me. Here's another one. This is the bail bonds and the backside of the Irwin C. Piper Technical Center. And from there, there's a question of how do you start rendering some of these spaces? And for me, it was through the use of the mill to produce some of these kind of pulled out and, for me, very beautiful surfaces that you can then assemble into a surface that you can then start to bring in a different framing of how to start looking at these spaces as both a use and an aesthetic quality. And then here's from the miniature an example of how might a dance studio for this conservatory be brought in. And then within the Dance Conservatory program, it's an interesting thing where you can start to think about what other programmatic elements you can package into a space like this that deals with looking at the urban infrastructure as a way to take advantage of what's there and reconsider what is possible. And I found the Gangsta Garden projects by Ron Finley to be very inspiring by looking at where you can find dirt and transform that into something that generates nutrition, green space, and beauty within some of these environments. Which is why I've been preoccupied with working with dirt and reassessing its value as something that you can both use as a symbol and as a physical material that at the very least I would build a miniature model from. And so thinking about scale and how this might appear within these areas, the idea of a lighthouse and how the lighthouse or the lifeguard station on the beach as a network of a repeated image that can be variable, can be of very different sizes, that starts to come in as a strategy. So if this is the map, this is something that might start to look at the diagram of where the Dance Conservatory occurs with the dashed line up against some of these larger monumental spaces. And then finally, this is the miniature that I ended up producing for this review. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you've tapped into Robert. First of all, what an awesome project, man! It's just such a strange and strangely beautiful piece of work that you're beginning to assemble. So yay! But I also think you're tapping into like one of the big developments in architecture of our time, which is always exciting, right? Because that means that you're part of something, you're part of your moment in a very deep way, and that is the notion of lining or tracing or adumbrating existing things as a method of intervention. So it's not about tearing something down and replacing it. And it's not about finding new ground to build something on, but it's about kind of an offset, which results in a thickened zone, which was once no one's and is now many people's. So I think as I look kind of across the landscape of thesis, and of course you guys are not in my group, so this is the first time I've seen your work, so it's very exciting for me. But if I look across the landscape of thesis, and I also think about what young practitioners are doing, like Anna, Christy, Mira, a lot of people in our faculty here at SCI-Arc, that stands out as one of the major moves that people are making. So it's fresh territory, which is great for you. It's great that you're working on that. And I think you have the opportunity now to define how you in specific are going to take that on. So the idea of the dashed line, which might result in kind of series of pavilions, feels like maybe that's your contribution to this emerging discourse. So I would want you to hone in on that now after miniatures. Hone in on that and really figure out the unit and the repetition. Are they all going to be individual units, or are they going to be a series of identical units? How are they going to relate specifically to the back side of the building that they butt up against? What is that in-between space going to be like there? How are you going to acknowledge that, or are you going to connect right to it? Are you going to leave your own kind of gap? You know, all that stuff. That's going to be, and also how are you going to deal with the leftover public space that's between your, thick object, it's one of your dashes in your dashed line. How are you going to deal with the leftover space between that and the street? And then how are you going to, maybe even most importantly, how are you going to deal with the gaps between your units? So if you could start thinking about going from miniatures where you did like maybe one mock-up, if you could start thinking about these as a kind of serial thing, kind of a long thing, I think it could be really exciting and really unique, and yet part of this larger discourse and part of this larger movement. So awesome choice of a thesis and very exciting.
Thank you, Marika.
Hey, Robert, quick question. First of all, great thesis, great project, very clear. Have you given thought to the interior of this project?
Yes, I have. And that's actually been one of the major questions is there an interior in the first place? Like, does a project like this necessarily have to be enclosed? Or can they occur as a series of surfaces that are just up against these other surfaces? I honestly don't know what the answer to that question is. My inclination is more towards a series of surfaces that don't necessarily have an enclosure. But yeah, to be honest, that's one of the things that I'm struggling with most, or trying to like really pin down, is the enclosure, and if that does produce an interior for these things.
I mean, it seems as though since this is the first review, you'll have time to work on the interior. So yeah. I really encourage you to. I think it's a beautiful project. I'm glad that Marika brought up like Mira and Matthew. I know you're probably familiar with their work, but they gave a lecture at Princeton, and they were talking about like the kind of detail of the column and the kind of rocks and the kind of texture that was happening. And so this idea of kind of an aesthetic decay, or a kind of material over time that you're starting to kind of represent, it'd be really interesting how you start to detail that. Mm-hmm. And so both on the exterior and then also figuring out how you work on the interior, it's a very exciting project. I love the mill, like just the kind of fidelity of the mill and the bricking is just extraordinary. So amazing miniature overall.
Thank you.
That being said, don't trap yourself unnecessarily in the vernacular of the known. To go back to what I was saying to Max, like it's one of the things that makes the mill beautiful is actually not its fidelity, but its near fidelity. So it's like a cast or a negative of the actual material that you were scanning in those lovely side-by-side film sequences. And it had, you know, one of the things that architecture can do is mess with your perception of the ordinary and the banal by tweaking it ever so. You know, like maybe things that would normally be porous and rough suddenly become glossy and slick, or maybe things that are so full of detail suddenly blur out a little bit, or the other way around. And so you got to own that. That's part of your aesthetic. It can't be as found, it can't be as given, because that's too much in the realm of the known and not enough in the realm of the kind of enchantment or darkness or viscosity that good architecture always brings to the table.
I'm excited to see that there's a kind of consistency among some of the projects in this sequence, that we're seeing a very like light touch in terms of the actual design proposals themselves, but an extreme like engagement in the kind of understanding of the implications, the analysis of the kind of contextual relationships and kind of effects that the work can have. And I think that's both like these kind of like urban politics proposals, and I think it's also, you could see it in Amanda's project in a kind of domestic setting too, that this is a theme that seems to be around. It's not, there's no kind of clumsily heavy-handed major architectural moves. When these happen, even big moves like Christopher's, these are moves that have been thought through painstakingly in terms of what they're intending to do and the things they're trying to enact.
Hey, Rob, just one quick thought. Sweet project.
Thanks, Ben.
What struck me most was when you said that the framing device was not just producing a different aesthetic quality, which is maybe expected or normal for a framing device to do, but that it produces a different use of the thing, like it generates program in addition to views. And so it got me, I mean, thinking about Ryan's comment about the interior, that was another question of mine, but if a framing device is able to generate program somehow in addition to just an image, it maybe suggests an idea about what those gaps between the two things, between your pavilions can be. I mean, just thinking about what other ways to think about an interior other than something just enclosed, but maybe just something between two frames.
Yeah, that's like a really beautiful thought. Thank you, Ben.
Yeah, I was thinking something similar in that you're producing a kind of urban interior. I mean, we can talk about kind of public plazas or public stages, but anytime you allow for a garden or for a place of gathering to occur, you're kind of producing, you're slowing things down, you're slowing these streets down, and they're not exactly enveloped, I guess, the way buildings are, but I think it's I love that Ryan brings up the term, because like now you can kind of think of it a little bit more intimately. And so that you're not dealing with this kind of the grid of the city, but you're still dealing with it, but you're kind of transforming it into something that you can even touch and understand as physical material. So to go back to some of Marika's kind of comments about the model. Rob, I mean, of course, I've been seeing the project develop, but I love the diagram that you showed, where we really understood the site plan as this kind of extension of the facade. I think it really makes a clear kind of visual point of where you're placing all of your effort and how it engages the entire site. Okay, so with that, thanks to everybody. Thanks, Rob.
Thank you, everybody.
I think you're super well positioned for the next month, so we're in good ground, literally, dirt. Luke, I pass the mic to you.
Great. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for hanging in there. I know these are long days. So to kind of re-center myself back in my research, I was really interested in the concept of void, and in doing further research and looking at the term itself. It's grounded in the concept of the riderless horse, or something having no occupant, the space in which no one is sitting. To me, what's really exciting about that moment is when you realize the vacation of a space. So a lot of my early studies were, these photo collages of riderless horses and kind of replacing them and slippages and things like that. Definition of the term itself. I was particularly interested in how different material applications and surface treatments can produce that phenomenon. I was looking at a lot of highly pigmented paints, things like Vanta Black, projects such as this one, Asif Khan's Hyundai Pavilion, and really trying to grasp how an actual material can kind of create the voided space and almost that kind of photoshopped out silhouette. The second silo of my research kind of came after reading Banham's American Deserta, which is a kind of his love affair with the desert. And so what I really dived into was kind of understanding our country's land management agencies. I found this particularly interesting during our current administration, where it feels like every day we pull up an article about a different wildlife or a different ecosystem that is being handed over to some kind of energy corporation. So I've been doing a deep dive into the makeup of and policies around our country's four main agencies: the Forest Service, BLM, National Park Service, and the Fish and Wildlife. So where those two worlds coalesce is a project that proposes the construction of a set of small, modular, and transportable pavilion elements, which can be deployed and reconstructed on a series of public land sites. The elements will explore the concept of void through different material applications of high contrast and ultra pigmented paints. The process of deployment and the pavilions will generate moments of personal isolation and introspection, raising questions of access and management to the outdoors and public lands. So the sites that I've selected are currently these four individual sites. I picked these in particular because they're each managed by a different service or by a different agency. And the idea is that the pavilion will actually travel between these different sites, and I'll try to understand how different landscapes actually interact with this voided kind of space. The bulk of my work so far has been in conversations with the different land management agencies. So reaching out to Forest Service, reaching out to BLM, and making sure that I have the adequate, permits and fees and everything paid. It's been quite interesting to kind of understand their take on different unsolicited art projects and struggling grad students' buildings. This has been some of the documentation of some of the sites that I've been looking at so far. So just kind of throughout the American West here. Onto my miniature. It's pretty self-explanatory at this point. This is my current travel setup. It is a trailer with 6 6x6 pressure-treated lumber beams and a toolbox full of basic portable power tools. The other kind of interesting part about all of the sites that I selected is that they all, to my understanding, should have cell service. So I should be able to kind of live document as I build and construct these different moments. So kind of harkening back to what Ryan was referencing earlier, it's almost a project of the documentation as much as it is the project itself. So I've done a series of kind of these small documentation strategies where this is a screen that I built and, you know, just documented the construction of in a fun kind of easy way. And then using that screen to actually then test my model in different sites. So
Luke, are you showing the screen? Because we don't see it.
cool.
We're still seeing
Awesome,
the pink
awesome.
background.
Okay, hold on, let me. All right, give me just a second. Well, I can get to that, but we can start discussing if that's all right.
Sounds good. Where are you right now, by the way? And what are you up to?
I'm at site number 2. So I'm in, or at site number 3, excuse me. I'm in Routt County, Colorado. The end goal is to get to my grandparents' farm where I have ample space to kind of test and build a number of these test models and document those, and then put them back on a trailer and come back west. So the idea is I'll spend the next month kind of developing small scale models and then a really nice large model that'll travel along with me as I come back to SCI-Arc. Eric, I wish I could ride a horse that well. I'm really not.
I mean, I remember you were exploring some of these themes when you were in my class a couple of semesters ago, and I'm always really heartened to see students developing projects over multiple semesters and finding ways to kind of like deepen their inquiry and new angles with which to approach it. I think it's super valuable for you as you launch yourself into the uncertain waters that we face today, to have done that, to kind of have stayed with it. And so I just I want to note that and note what a helpful thing that is for you. I think normally I would be excuse me. Normally I would be dead set against the pavilion as a temporary thing because it moves the project dangerously close to what I would call a kind of amateur art practice, which has a different discourse. However, in your case, dealing as you are with the American management of land, it is fully appropriate. There's a famous historian of American settlement who called the United States a violent, disordered camping trip. And that still, I think, rings true today. And by making these things temporary, or even making it one thing that moves around, you're highlighting in some ways the fragility and the temporariness, and also the, as the quote suggests, the violence with which we approach our land in the US. Now, having said that, I don't want the project to only live in documentation. I want the project to be sort of fully embedded in the spatial apparatuses of architecture. Just again, thinking about your next moves, Luke, after school. So I want you to be very careful and consequent about, let's say, like those ordinary things like corner details, joints and connections, and just, I want you to produce something that has the eloquence of the Hyundai Pavilion and exceeds that eloquence to become maybe have more of a silhouette, maybe have more of a kind of strange presence in the landscape than just a kind of vernacular assemblage, which is where you know, with the little trailer and stuff right now, I realize I'm echoing my own comments here, but you got to be careful about staying too much in the known and the ready-made. That's not our discourse. You got to push yourself to, if it's going to be a little trailer, you got to design that thing, you know, and you have to make it something that is uniquely your aesthetic and build your aesthetic into this project so that it launches you into your practice going forward.
Hey, Luke. I had a potentially silly precedent reference for you, or maybe you've already been looking at these, but it's hardly miniature and hardly temporary, but I guess you could sort of think about them as pavilions in the landscape, which are dams, like river dams. So just thinking about on that list of land management agencies, one of them, which is, I guess, has a lot smaller footprint than the others, but probably has a significant amount of built stuff on its footprint, is the Bureau of Reclamation, which built all these dams. So yeah, I don't know if it is helpful in like conceptually or aesthetically, or maybe just thinking about like how people would build dams. They would, you know, bring their construction site like you are doing, like out into a place where there's no electricity and there's no, they just have to have their own self-contained construction practice, and then they would erect something that will never ever go away.
That's a great reference. And it would be super interesting to talk to them and see their response to having someone come and like do some kind of installation. There would be really, I'm sure, of all of my experience so far, probably the most decisive.
Luke, it's a really interesting project. I am incredibly ambitious, I have to say, to also travel right now and organize yourself to that. So I'm already really impressed on where that project is heading. The way you're setting it up, I think, is really insightful and smart. One question that I had, and maybe I just missed it, the beginning part. Is it a rider or a horse or whatever it is, the presence of the void and the relationship to how you're starting to choose your sites or how your miniature model is panning out? Can you explain that to me again?
Yeah, I think one of my struggles has been that I've in kind of digging into the you know, and digging into the communication side and digging into the permitting side and frankly the kind of travel and you know, organizational side, the fundamentals of the design have certainly gone by the wayside, and that is what the next month is, I think, really.
Sure. I mean, I honestly, I wanted to see if I missed the connection, or if that's something you want to sort of return back to as a way of creating a presence in a site without actually being vernacular, to kind of go back to Marika's terms, right? Which, I mean, there's this conversation that, I mean, it's a little bit older, but I think Tom Wiscombe, David Drew, and Todd Gannon, I think, had that conversation, right? In Locke, where I think it was Tom talked about the Mises Neue Nationalgalerie as an idea of a black void. Mm-hmm. I wonder if you can kind of tack onto that and start to think about how that could be useful for you as a design proposal. Obviously on a smaller scale, obviously in the scope of the provocational sort of setup that you already set for yourself, for the site, for the way you're building it, the way you're starting to think about details, but maybe on what that would mean in terms of design and form.
Great.
look, I want to say that Maya's point is so important because, I mean, she's really tying together some of the work that you've done more kind of, I guess, visually with the things that you're doing physically. And some of the things that you haven't talked about, and maybe this is something in the back of your mind, and maybe it's almost too obvious to say, is that, of course, the projects in the West are also, or in this kind of vast landscape, are also projects of like land art projects, which are voids, you know, quite literally. So like Judd and Heitzer and all these kind of macho boys who build out things with dynamite. But I guess I wonder how, relating it back to like the picture that you have hanging in the background, how you relate, let's say, some of these things that are maybe a little bit more abstract and dealing with the power of tools and power tools in relationship to things that are actually kind of pastoral and almost nostalgic. Like, I think you're gonna have to kind of bridge those gaps and really understand your aesthetic sensibility and how you begin to engage this landscape and how you begin to document what you're doing.
Great.
We're at about a couple of minutes, so if anybody wants to make a final comment, he's shaking his head. Luke, were you able to find the videos of the curtain? I mean, I think they're kind of nice, but if you're not able to pull them up, it's okay.
Yeah, I think now I just lost it again. I'll put them up on Mira.
Maybe just as a kind of shout out, it's, you know, you bought a shower curtain, and so most of the initial work was done through projection onto this really utilitarian $7 object. But it's kind of, I just find it kind of amazing that we can kind of produce these images with, or at least that you have kind of figured out certain things that you've brought along for the ride.
I would say one last thing to suggest, and this is going back to Maya's comment too, remember your collages. Don't lose sight of those collages, because the offsets and the silhouettes, the outlines of those figures are really powerful. And I would love to see some of that, you know, because it's one thing to make a square void, right? It's another thing to create a kind of evocative silhouette that's near something you know, but is not something you know. It gives you a kind of eerie, like, almost, it gives you a kind of way to engage with something in an intense and disturbing, but positive way. That's simply putting a kind of blank, like bar, like the Hyundai, you know, that's my problem with the Hyundai Pavilion by Asaf Khan, in the landscape won't have. So I just think those initial studies are important and valuable as you go forward.
Great.
Thank you. And I see that also Zainab added a bunch of things. So take notes. Thank you, Luke. Thanks to all the comments. And I passed the mic to Zaina and her group. So she'll kind of moderate the discussion from now on. I'll keep time for your students. So we'll kind of keep on going. So now I pass it to Wendy. And Zaina, if you want to say a few words about how you're working, maybe this is a good moment.
Sure, yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. So I have 3 students. 2 are MArc 1 students, and 1 is an MArc 2 student. And so Wendy, Sam, and Ovgu will present last. The projects are quite diverse. You're going to see very different approaches, but also very different, I would say, topics and positions. They both, I would say the first 2 projects have a kind of affinity, let's say, in that they are interested in programs that have historically dealt with questions of like collectivity, the body, the gaze, and the politics around that. And I will let, you know, Wendy and Sam kind of describe more specifically what they're working on. And the last project is a really interesting, also cultural project that takes on the question of the meme, and Ovgu will talk about this. But it is one of the challenges I think have been in some of these theses is how does one take a cultural project and turn it into an architectural one? And so I'd love the conversation today to be about, you know, how do we intervene culturally and politically with our tools as architects, and what are the kind of processes for us to work in this way? I think that would be a really interesting discussion. So I don't want to take up too much time. Wendy, you're next.
Alrighty, let me just situate myself. And then Zaina, if you can spotlight my video.
Yes.
Thanks.
Everybody
Alrighty.
sees this full screen? Okay, good. I will mute myself.
Yep.
Okay. So, hello, my name is Wendy, and my thesis will be focusing on the performance and design of embassies, U.S. embassies to be specific. What we see on the screen is my miniature model that consists of an object, a mirror, a two-way mirror, and a beam splitter glass. These are some of the materials I've been testing by stacking, moving, rotating to create a series of physical acts that can produce a semiotic and optical effect that will be documented through videos, plans, and images. The optical effects are of deception, many of which I researched in my thesis prep. Through these tests, I found two things that will help inform my thesis. First is the effect of simultaneity. In order for these effects to be convincing, the conditions must be dynamic, not always visible or always hidden, but rather both. Second is the gaze. Where and how is the assembly? Where and how the assembly is viewed, or rather the audience. Going forward, I will be building a mechanized rig to test these materials on to consider accuracy and assembly systems for the embassy. I will now be sharing my screen. And we're looking at my mural board. I don't know if Zaina, you would like to also add the link again for the new guests. So when the U.S. designs and builds embassies and consulates, they refer to the OBO building code, and the OBO is the Overseas Building Operation. And here you will find occupancy requirements, energy efficiency tests, finishes, protection features, etc. Next to it, we have the GAO report, and the GAO is the Government Accountability Office, and this is a report from 2017 that highlights the areas of improvement or rather a failure of the State Department's management of embassies. And next to it, we have the Design Excellence Guiding Principles. This right here is an Obama-era initiative which planned to undo all of the Bush administration design to embassies, which basically they look like tall prisons with really small apertures. They weren't very friendly, and they definitely weren't cultural messengers to its host city. So in tandem with the design of a new embassy, I will be creating a document of my own that will act as a set of guidelines of investigations to respond or amend these documents. I'm also working on an archive, a visual archive, that are listed on the usembassy.gov website. There's about 135 embassies that are officially listed. And behind that is a contact sheet of all of the images I've collected thus far. And through this visual exercise, I noticed there's a difference on how the Department of State, journalists, civilians, and Google Maps images these embassies, and how the discrepancies between the representations, how they're always kind of in flux. And what I'm finding is how the US has presented an image in foreign territories through a particular building typology, the embassy. In some cases, it acts as a cultural messenger. In others, it shows force, and in a few, apathy. I pulled some anomalies from this visual data set. And what I found is a pattern that I noticed was that the embassy is typically the location to protest its anger or dissatisfaction with the United States government, and it becomes a civic stage. And as we understand, the embassy is a place of diplomacy that bridges two nations and its citizens, and the diplomatic relationships are always in flux. The current embassy typology deals with presence in its host city and the struggle with equilibrium in a society that is constantly changing. Next steps is to keep adding to my visual archive of US embassies. And the goal is to make a comprehensive list that includes multiple gazes, either diplomatic, riotous, or of admiration. I will also be physically testing and analyzing the relationship between of my miniature materials to their cultural and political implications, two-way mirrors and surveillance, and beam splitter glass with its presidential teleprompter. Also creating a mechanized rig that will help with the seamless movement of the optical planes, which will lead to the organization of the program, which is diverse and unsurprisingly includes a lot of secret and hidden rooms. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. So should we look at Miro, or do you want me to also spotlight your video? Wendy? Wendy, are you still with us?
Sam, maybe you can text Wendy to see if
we
she's
lost her.
Yeah, one thing we could do is give her a couple of minutes. Maybe we can jump to another presentation.
I think I have a feeling maybe something crashed.
Yeah,
I think her computer crashed. She just texted me.
Okay.
Sam, if you're ready, jump in. Yeah.
Okay. Going to, 1 second, share my screen.
Sam, let me know if I need a spotlight. Are you doing, I don't know if you're doing.
I'm just gonna share my screen. Is this working for people? Okay, hi, I'm Sam. For my thesis, I'm imagining ceramics as a medium between the individual and collective bodies. The history of ceramics has always moved between these two scales, from proto-toilet paper to early filtration systems. The ceramic tectonic connects life to material, material to life. By rethinking Western fixtures and spatial planning, the thesis revolves around ceramic psychosexual materiality and archival processing. The images that you are looking at now are an example of the historical processing that I've been looking at. Looking at the history of the ceramic vessel and the practice of kintsugi, which you see in the middle image, which is a Japanese reconstruction process for ceramic fragments in which the infill is highlighted in gold. On the left and right side, you see a forensic reconstruction of ceramic fragments using provisional scaffolding. The sort of animated fragments which are overlaid are an initial attempt at combining a digital ceramic as a reconstructive medium. To return to this idea of ceramic and its materiality, I have been sort of looking at the cultural dimension to this material and the types of spaces which are clad in ceramic, specifically the bathroom. So ceramics poses a conflation of our inner and outer space. Intimacy of the body is manifested as a transscalar dimension. The vessel shows the intimacy of the cup at the scale of the wash basin and at the scale of the room. The metamorphosis of materiality of ceramics has a parallel with the social interaction of bodies within the ceramic space. The body receives the vessel, and the vessel receives the body. The images that you're looking at now are different projections on toilet geometries that span from ancient Roman bathing rituals to more contemporary ergonomic designs. And on the right is a catalog of how a woman may design the bathroom, which is identifying the sort of problematic history of the bathroom in domestic space. Okay. So what is the ceramic space? I've been developing a hybrid between an analog and a digital ceramic, looking to the labor history of ceramics as an entry point in the catalog and encyclopedia of ceramic practice by Diderot, as well as CNC and AI machine learning workflows to remove the author from the design process, as well as reference a manufacturing process in the pre-visualization. So what you're looking at is different sort of spec renderings of what sort of surface I am developing. And finally, this is an image of the miniature model that I made. So I am designing a tectonic which exploits the transscalar and cultural dimension of ceramics. Looking at archival processes and closed system building typologies, the thesis develops a vessel for collective living. So with that, we can go to the Miro board, where I have more references, as well as a Twitch live stream link, which is has like an input of my studio setup. Thank you.
Sam, do you mind if I share my screen with the Twitch for a second?
Yes. I've never had so many viewers on my Twitch. It's great.
There's sound, so I invite you guys to watch it on your own. Thank you, Sam.
Thanks.
Sam, this is such a cool project. I'm sorry, I will pass the mic in a second, but I had a question about the encyclopedia, like the D'Alembert and Diderot pages, and how you now compare to, let's say, contemporary labor techniques and materials, and what kind of encyclopedic page your project would produce out of this, these new processes that you're incorporating. I'm curious how to kind of take those pages that are so beautifully put together with the tools and the hands and the objects, and how you're kind of deconstructing and reconstructing them back.
That's a great question.
Very good question.
I mean, we've been talking about creating zines and like also this idea of a spec drawing. And I think that those encyclopedia pages are sort of a combination of like something that's very analytical, but also kind of framing what the politics of labor are. And so in a lot of those pages, you'll see like a high and a low distinction, which I think was initially what jumped out to me. So maybe like to bring it back, like my own encyclopedia would kind of also try to classify a value system.
And what value system is that?
Well, I've been looking at sort of the DIY and the machine. So my studio setup currently is very like only one material, have to bring a bucket of water down to the carport. And then the sort of opposition to that is 3D printing and milling, as well as AI for generating the forms.
You know, I think it would be it's going to be necessary for you, Sam, with incredible rapidity, like this afternoon or tomorrow, to stake your position here in much clearer terms than you've done so today. Okay, it is, you I'm sure are aware with all of your research into ceramics, the traditional relationship that has existed since ancient Greek philosophy between the notion of making things by hand, for instance, particularly things with clay, and the old idea of hylomorphism, that you would basically be able to apply whatever form you liked to matter. And the role that that has played historically in the subjugation of laboring classes, particularly enslaved peoples. And the relationship between that and the long-running dualism within architecture, between the kind of the elite arts, noble thought, noble arts, and the manual labor that goes into producing much of the world around us. And I think for you, because you're working with ceramics, and because at the moment you seem to be limiting yourself to various manual techniques and digital techniques, which you're presenting as though they have inherent labor ethics associated with them, but in fact may have the exact opposite ethics you think you're supporting. It is vital that you say, this is what I'm going for. This is the world I envision. This is who I want to, this is where I want to stake my claim when it comes to how things are produced in the world and what values they are said to embody, right? In positive terms, like a posit, a position. Because otherwise, I think you're going to risk kind of just stirring the pot here with literally with a kind of a weird digital manual sludge that is not going to embody the new ethics and the new aesthetic that I know you want to be part of. And when you make general claims like, well, the labor politics, or something is very problematic, that is easy. That is easy, and that keeps you in the realm of the no. But for you, this is such a cool thing to have hit on in this particular moment in time. The kind of the freshness of taking something with such hylomorphic connotations and pushing it out of that zone and saying, we cannot look at matter this way, we cannot look at labor this way, we cannot be a part of the system anymore. The freshness of that, you risk losing it if you don't stake your claim.
Sorry, Marika, if I may interrupt for a second, I think maybe because we don't have a ton of time left, it would be helpful to maybe steer the conversation towards some of the sort of main, let's say, interests that Sam is working with. I think I agree. Maybe this claim that you made around labor is problematic, and I would take Marika's point seriously about that. But I think it would be helpful to maybe talk about some of the sort of main themes that Sam is exploring, where he's interested in the idea of a ceramic space, something that he called scalar, which is that, you know, vessels, the history of vessels that he'd been looking at have a kind of, have always had a cultural dimension of collectivity at different scales, from the scales of the cup to the scale of, let's say, an urn, or some kind of sharing plate or something like that, to the scale of the bathtub, and then eventually, or the toilet, and then eventually to the scale of the room. And so I think, like, maybe we could, because I think that's where Sam needs most help, is we could maybe steer the conversation toward the program moving forward. Some of these processes that you're working with, Sam, are around ways of making and ways of, as Marika was saying, hybridizing perhaps more analog casting techniques with more numerical molding techniques like CNC milling, right? And using the kind of toolpath of that as a way to generate, and then again through AI, as a way to generate fragments that then could be tectonically assembled. So you're sort of you're producing tools and ways of making building elements that will then be assembled and implemented for the design of the domestic space that you're talking about here. So maybe, Sam, you could just clarify real quick, because we don't have a ton of time, your intentions for how this ceramic space would unfold moving forward, and why do you think that why is your position around the kind of what you're calling the intimate property of the ceramic, why is that important moving forward, and how will it develop and unfold into a program? And eventually a site, which you don't have yet. So.
Right. No, I mean, I even think that Marika's point about sort of making a claim is something that I'm struggling with. And so I do want to kind of work on that more. But I think this sort of idea and this commitment to ceramics and an all ceramic system is coming from both an ecological point of view, in which, like, I'm thinking about ideas of permaculture, a closed system, in terms of like waste management, and also in production on site versus like modular and prefabricated. And so a really important precedent, I think, for me has been the Schindler House, which uses both this idea of casting in place the walls and also an alternative collaborative, cooperative living. And even though it's a little old, I think that there are things to learn from that. So yeah, I think the program is going to be a collective, a sort of like tenancy in common collective dwelling unit.
I think you could be more emphatic about that, because you have been in you're developing tectonic systems for you know, building eventually this sort of dwelling unit that you're calling, right? But it's not clear today what it would look like, who it would house, you know, who would live in it, etc.
I want to also ask Ryan and Brian and I to jump in, because we're always clicking against the clock. So it would be wonderful to hear from you, because I think the project is so aesthetic and craft-based that you have a lot of knowledge to bring.
Yeah, I just wanted to say quickly, I like the project, Sam. I think for me, the miniature, the model, has the most potential. There's two things, I mean, maybe three things I think of. I'm sure you've seen Alex Reed, his work, who does ceramics. He uses architecture as an artist, right, as opposed to an architect using, let's say, art. In your case, I don't think that applies, but there's a certain level of craft and rigor to the construction of his ceramics, versus the kind of miniature you have reminds me very much of the LADG kind of casting. I don't know if you're familiar with that work. I can paste it in the link, but there's a certain aesthetic quality that's taking place, whether it starts to deal with heaviness or the kind of texture that's a result. And then so the question is, how do you start to translate that up in scale if it is about space or program? And then the comment you had mentioned about, let's say, sustainability or the earth or recyclability or whatever, I would look at Joshua Stein and his work, who does a lot of research on that as well. But for me, the miniature is the most fascinating, and I would even consider maybe scanning that to try and create a kind of feedback loop back into the digital. might be a good way of approaching the connection between the two.
Yeah, which Sam you have been doing.
Sam,
yeah,
I think.
I'll go next. Fine, please.
Go ahead.
Okay. Sam, I mean, I think the good news is that the project has, I think, when you showed the sort of ending, the form that you produced, I mean, it was really compelling and really amazing. So I think that the good news is it seems to be that the process is going to lend itself to creating something that's incredibly visually striking. I guess that's why you're trying to work on the narrative. But what you were describing, or your conversation that you had, really reminded me of, I don't know if you're familiar with Mark Burry, but he was the architect on the remodeling of Gaudi's church in Barcelona, and it was a sort of taking, you know, you can find, he has many lectures online that you can find where they're showing techniques from Gaudi, where it's a little bit different than just casting. It's actually like a system of pouring and like using like railed surfaces to like produce like three-dimensional surface without just sort of a cast system. And then the way that he's trying to, you know, a lot of people came out of his sort of parametric ideas. I'm not a fan of parametric architecture. I'm not trying to say that, but Mark Burry has some really interesting, and a lot of interesting people came from him. So I think that if you find that, and then it gets into the ideas, I think that if you start to get into notions rather than just casting, because casting is going to lead you to like a contemporary version of like Ensemble Studio, and I think that that's the sort of danger zone in that, is that you're going to be recreating sort of cast objects that are then recreated, or the fragments of. I think that there's some other way of actually playing with the object and then bringing it back into the computer. That it isn't just such a one-degree notion of production, a cast, and then the final output. I would suggest actually like trying to scan it, bring it back, and augment it. Maybe you can start to produce the duality between the two. And then I think what was the final comment was also because of the sort of broken, I mean, it reminded me of some Ensemble Studio projects. Are you familiar with Ensemble Studio, Sam?
No, but I am looking.
I guess if you look, you'll see some sort of familiar sort of tones. But I mean, even the idea of the sort of corduroy concrete, I think is a fantastic idea of the memories, the trace memories of the computational. But how also you had this sort of great image with the green background, right? That was then to be used as a green screen as well, which is also now bringing it back into the digital again. So that's what the idea that I guess I have is, how do you kind of create a recursive loop of not only casting, but like other do-it-yourself issues that you'll see within the Gaudi sort of way of producing three-dimensional objects, and then bringing into the computer and augmenting on that. I think that the green in it is like a step towards that, which I think is really interesting.
I don't know if I have
Lastly, I thought a really great quote for you, if you can find it, Louis Kahn talking about when he was designing this sort of master plan for, I believe it was Chicago, but his quote on that one was from the city to the teacup. I thought that was always a nice little sentence line. Sorry.
Maya, would you like to final comments?
I don't. Okay, final comment, Sam. I really love the project. I think it's beautiful. I think the Twitch video is really beautiful. I agree with all the critique points that were made in the beginning, but I do think you have a really great setup in terms of what you already produce in terms of visual expertise. I would hone into, I think in the very end you said something like, therefore this thesis is a vessel for collective living. What does that even mean? I mean, I think for me the imagery that you produced has more something to do with thickness and porosity of the different media, that you're sort of fluidly moving in and out of, kind of like what Brian was saying in the end, right? I think you're already doing that, but you might want to talk about that a little bit more, because the vessel in the traditional sense is a relationship between container and contained, but I think you're already moving beyond that, and you want to talk about that.
Yeah, and that's precisely how you get out of the hylomorphic loop that I was critiquing at the bit. It is going to be about not ever, you know, to use the other Lucon thing that we all love to hate, you know, what does the Brit want to do? It's how you get out of that mode of servant and served that is haunting this project.
Okay, thank you guys. So I know this is a little bit in reverse because Wendy cut out, but if we could maybe go back to Wendy's projects and have a conversation. And if you need a quick, maybe sort of summary, let us know.
Sorry, we're going back to the last project, is that correct? Is there a way to just quickly thumbnail 2 seconds through? This is my short-term memory.
Yeah, Wendy, maybe you could share the mirror real quick and show the different components, but please keep it very brief.
So, Wendy, one thing that was not clear to me in your presentation was whether or not you intend the outcome at the end of the thesis to be that you are going to design an embassy? Or was it more like you're going to design the protocols around embassy design?
Zaina, can you share the mural board? I can't find it. I have so many windows open right now. And so to Marika, I'm hoping to do both. It sounds a little ambitious, but definitely investigating new typologies for embassies, as well as possibly drafting up a document that can inform these processes in the style of a state-mandated document.
Maybe you should talk a little bit more about the program, the embassy as theater, as a way to maybe foreground also your ambitions for the next step.
So, as we understand, an embassy is there to form a relationship between its host country and the country and the visitor. And so there's a lot of program that is very public, and sometimes this can be a cafe, sometimes it's a theater, and there's definitely offices, administrative offices, but there's also a lot of hidden program that we don't get to see, such as the ambassador's apartment, or a lot of panic rooms, and a lot of entryways and exitways that we don't get to see because of security reasons. And so this all seems to me that since the relationship between an embassy and its host city is always in flux, that this can also be set up as a stage so that all of these parts are moving. And as I've highlighted in my visual archive, that usually the embassies is a set to demonstrate either your happiness with the embassy or your discontent with the embassy of the visitor city, visitor country.
Yeah, Wendy, I remember now. Sorry, I forgot briefly that you just had to say embassy and then I'm back. If I'm allowed today, I think we are, because we're all having like an all SCI-Arc kind of review. If I could be nostalgic towards my second year at SCI-Arc, and we were helped with a critic that's also on today's, but I believe he's on Zago's review. Joe Day was involved in the studio slightly, and we were looking at his thesis that he did, I believe, at SCI-Arc, which was where he was studying prisons for his thesis. And just the way that you would have one person that could let's say, overwhelm or control 100 people in that way, that the program itself could control a large group of people through one person. So we actually, Joe Day wasn't the professor of the class, it was actually another professor, but we had Joe come in to give a lecture on his thesis. And then we actually went to a prison ourselves and had to walk through the prison that was actually functioning, but you see the sort of idea of how there's like one person. So there's that sort of idea of, in the case of when you find the drawings, I guess, when you're looking for embassies, the black area or the poche in that sense, right, of like the lack of information or lack of understanding, because you'd have the visitor which gives very small space. I'm thinking of the times I've been to an embassy, which is just like a little waiting room basically for the public, and then the sort of back of the house that's quite unresolved, or that the public doesn't understand, right? I mean, like you said, there's like levels of safety and how one can move through it, right? The person up to the ambassador. And then I was also thinking of a conversation I just was having with a recent, or a graduate of SCI-Arc from my time that's working I don't know if it's, I guess it's probably not to be shared information, so I just won't mention the architect's office, but they're doing a government project. And right now there's a major debranding happening with American buildings, because wherever anything that says the United States on it now becomes kind of an area for protest around the world. So there's this interesting kind of way of not using icons within American architecture that I find interesting as well. And then lastly, you spoke quickly to like people an assembly, or how people assemble in these projects. And it's maybe quite different, because I haven't studied embassies to a great extent, but I am a big fan of seeing, like, also when we talk about this kind of controlling of program, also parliaments have that sort of assembly and how they meet, and how they also, you know, the parliament's layout is actually dictated by if it's by the government. And, you know, like there's a really interesting parliament, of course, in England, where it's actually kept small, and it actually has fewer representatives because the room's so small that they don't want to make a bigger room or a bigger hall. So it's like it's containing the government, but they have like classroom style or like a semicircle. There are all these things that like dictate to what the kind of government policy is within a parliament. And I'm wondering if there's that sort of understanding as well, like when you said the assembly, or how people assemble within these spaces. And I guess you were alluding to, you were showing these sort of reflective surfaces that remind me of like kind of 50s artists playing with this sort of reflectivity. So maybe, I mean, I know we're so short on time today, but can you speak quickly about your idea of what the idea of, I believe you were showing these sort of one-way mirrors, correct? That kind of got me thinking about this sort of, when we went to visit the jails where the people are behind the one-way mirror, that you can't see if they're looking at you or not.
Right, so my miniature kind of dealt with a collection of these materials that I've been investigating. One of them is a two-way mirror, and also the semiotic relationship that this has. So usually a two-way mirror is associated with surveillance. And then I also have a beam splitter glass that is usually represented by a presidential teleprompter. And so what I'm looking at, and so from what I understand and what I'm pushing for, is that the embassy is constantly in flux. It's always moving. It's always being seen, but also being hidden. And so through these assembly of mirrors, both as possibly tectonic, but representationally, that we can create these effects of deception, of hiddenness, and of visibility simultaneously.
Nice. But is it the worry is that I guess it becomes a bit, or maybe the good thing that could happen is, would it become like these, I don't know if they still have them, but when I was a child, they had these like fun houses that you would run through, and it was like mirror window, and sometimes you'd smack into it because you actually got so lost with where you are with the play of reflection. Have you ever been, do you know what I don't know if those still exist. I think they were called fun houses. Is that kind of an idea that you're getting to? It's like this sort of new fun house where people go through sort of maze with the reflectivity?
Right.
Right.
I hope it's not that, yeah.
Oh, but I mean, that could be, there is interesting, because you are trying to say, you are going to have to divide the project into like different programs and where people are allowed to go, correct?
Right,
and
so there can be thresholds of program, exactly.
And these thresholds are broken through ideas of reflectivity and porosity and clear, these terms that you were using.
I do feel like right now there maybe is actually too much stuff in this thesis. Somehow I think, Wendy, that you might need to like shed some of the aspects of this investigation, just knowing that they'll come back. Like knowing that eventually you've got a lifetime to work on this assembly of stuff. But just for the time being, if you maybe focus on the spectral quality or the optical quality of the disease, and think about how you might get at that architecturally, maybe that would be a helpful focus. And if you do go in that direction, then I think you should go back and just reread that old piece by Rowe and Slutsky on literal and phenomenal transparency, just to kind of give yourself something to tee off of, so that you say, like, this project is going to be transparent, but it's not going to be transparent in that old, that old way, that old dichotomy between the literal and the phenomenal. But it's going to be about a new kind of transparency or a new kind of opacity or whatever it needs to be. And then you define that for yourself, and just define it real simply, excuse me, real simply in like architecturally specific terms. Like, these are the effects that could produce this. Or these are the kind of the stacks of different kind of lensing that could produce this, or things like that, just so that you give yourself the space in terms of the amount of time that you have left to work on this thesis to get to that building.
Why?
Yeah.
Because sometimes the how is easier to do.
Any last comments? We have to wrap up soon.
I think it's a beautiful, I just wanted to say quickly, I think it's a promising thesis. I'd really look at the mirror, both two-way and one-way. I was thinking about a precedent from Jean Nouvel, who did a hotel where you can look on the ground floor and you're not actually looking at the ground floor, you're looking at the basement because he's playing with optical illusions. So like literally looking at your miniature to create optical illusions in addition to this kind of privacy connotation that you're looking at, I think could be really fascinating.
I was also thinking that, and I'll also maybe ask Maya to jump in at the end, but I was thinking that when Brian was speaking about Joday's work, that, you know, the old way of thinking about power was a kind of panoptic experience in the prison system. And that, Wendy, what you bring up is a different kind of panopticism, I guess, one that isn't linked to one point of view, but to this kind of a very varied and multiple points of view. I mean, I've said this to my students when we were sitting in front of the Zoom, is that the Zoom is the new panopticon, because the eye of the camera is constantly capturing us and we're always in a way under surveillance in front of one another. But I think you're dealing with something that is in between the thing that's purely virtual and the thing that is purely physical, which is the Bantham kind of circular building plan. And that's where I'm curious where kind of some of the special effects, I guess, of your planning and of your architecture will become really amazing when you begin to kind of bring those things together.
Yeah, I agree. I think, Wendy, you've been collecting in the last week or so, collecting a sort of catalog of let's call them, I guess, optical effects for now. And I think you've been also trying to explore what are the optical effects of deception, let's say. Some of the archival work you did early on were basically finding images of embassies in very strange states on the web, right? Whether they are literally blurred as a kind of censorship act, or whether they have been let's say, digitally graffitied or manipulated digitally to convey certain like political positions, like people angry at certain embassies, or the opposite, let's say. So I think like in some ways you're starting to have two parallel projects that need to somehow collide into the design of the embassy. It's time to design the embassy essentially, and to have more clear organizational systems that allow you to test out these optical effects that you're exploring both digitally and physically into some kind of plan or building. So that's really imminent, I think, at this point. Yeah. Thank you, Wendy. So the next project is Ovgu. Are you ready?
Yeah. So I will share my screen. Okay. Okay. Hi everyone, my name is Ovgu, and my thesis is called Deal With It. So I wanted to look at architecture that existed in a world in which everything happens at once, because I have a position against monosemy, which means that architecture having just one meaning and having one solution that it posits, and that doesn't necessarily raise questions, it has just one narrative. I think that monosemy has a certain danger to it, which is why I had this comportment to freedom against it. So I started to posit toward polosemy, which means things having more than one meaning and having more than one stories. And I started to look according to that for cultural phenomenon, in today's world that was polysemist. And one very prominent aspect of that was the meme culture. When you look at memes, they're cultural phenomena that communicate and analyze very sincerely situations in the world with very advanced irony, and they satirize. So it's polysemism that it's sincere, ironic, and satirical all at the same time. So the word meme was first coined by Richard Dawkins in 1976, and he called it a unit of culture transmission that propagates itself by latching on other information. And in 1994, the idea of an internet meme was coined, and it just follows the same vein, just on the internet. So meme came about when chat rooms on the internet started to develop, and it came to a point where there are new forms where people were communicating only with images. So they started to make this new collective memory of certain images that had certain moods, certain tones, and they communicate very specific things. And that's how memes came to be. Memes have their period starting from the 2000s until now. And the one thing that I was very interested in was what is called the late stage meme. The late stage meme is very different than the rest of the memes because this is a backlash against advertisers who started to use memes as a way of selling things. And people started to use this sincere vein of analyzing the word with an irony that was so extreme, it doesn't have a meaning. So like these memes are made so that they convey absolutely no meaning, and they satirize everything that tries to latch onto them that is not a meme. So that brings up the first question of my thesis. How does architecture operate with a comportment to freedom through or by using satire? And the second question is, can we take the cultural phenomenon of memes and translate it into the architectural discipline? So this is a meme that I started to analyze for the sake of it. And the first thing that I brought up was, what is the technique of making this? What are the rules and what are the processes? So I first made a close reading that started to replicate the process of making this meme. So just for your reference, this is the meme. It's called Meme Man in Space. Meme Man is that head. And this is a close reading I made. And this is a technical analysis. There's three-dimensional space, there are flat images, it works with found objects, it has different opacities and clashing fonts, and there's absolutely no meaning in the context. So the one thing that I want to highlight is the found objects vein being a very strong one in the meme culture, and we're going to come back to that again. So in replicating the process, it was a bit simple. This is the three-dimensional aspect. So I found the head, meme man, downloaded it, put it into Rhino, make the box, assign the texture, and then put meme man in the meme space, pun intended, anyway. And then this is the flat process. So I had to switch to Photoshop, I put in the fonts, they clash, and then the 12 of found objects in this was mushrooms. So I photoshopped a bunch of mushrooms into the image and then played with their opacities. So there's always a clash between opaque and transparent, one font, the other font, blurry and clean edges. And this is my results. This is the original meme, and this is side by side. So this brings up a process of taking a 2D image and seeing how it can be replicated in 3D. So the third question is, how is this going to work for architecture? How do you apply this into architecture? And I started to look for precedents for how this was made in architecture. The predominant precedents I found were public art, not necessarily architectural, so I had to go way back to Jean-Jacques Lecoeur, 18th century, 19th century architect. So Lecoeur belongs to this milieu called visionary architects who were educated right before the French Revolution and then were jobless after the revolution because they were supposed to work for nobility. So they had to resort to paper. They started to use architecture or make architectural arguments just by drawing with no physical constraints. But Lecoeur is very different than the rest. He is basically a bourgeois weirdo. You can see from the portraits and the work that he produces that he's not necessarily aspiring to the same lofty ideals as the others. And I call Lecoeur the first meme architect. And this comes back to the found objects that I highlighted before. He works with a lot of objects that were then not acceptable to be used in architecture, and he just mashes them together in this neoclassical order. And he was also a very satirical architect. So the cow work that I keep showing is a result of this one monument that was an elephant that was being built for 6 years, first for the king and then for Napoleon, and it just couldn't get finished. And at the end, Leclerc was like, you know what, just make it a cow, put it in the middle of nowhere, no monument or stuff. It's just a stable. And I think that Leclerc is very relevant to today because just like Leclerc, we were educated in a word that is not going to be the same word once we graduate. So we have to rethink about how we're going to practice after that. So that's my fourth question. Who is today's Leclerc? And I started to address that question by taking the same technique that I developed before and applying it to the images of Leclerc. So this brings us to my miniatures. 4 pieces, and I'm going to explain each one of them. So I came back to the cow, and I put it in Maya. I tried to replicate the cow. Not exact replication, but it's still an illusion, and also my version too. So put in the cow, drape a cloth, extrude cloth, and then put an urn. And this is the results. This is how it looks once you look at it in a 3-dimensional aspect. And this is the Leclerc's cow compared to the Maya cow. So there were a lot of glitches in making this cow. I found it funny. The extrusion of the cloth was a challenge, and I don't know, like that was something that always came up. So I made a meme out of this process, just assigned an architect that could have corresponded to whatever shape came out of this. So back to the cow. This is my cow miniature. This is what it looks like on Rhino. And this is the orthographic views, elevations and plan. And this is the final version. And I went back to Socrates' tomb. So this is the same thing. You do a close reading, there's a pedestal, it has a gate, it has ornaments, and then there's a prominent statue on top of it. That is a found object. So I did the same thing. There's a pedestal, upsloping, it has ornamentation, and then there's another object. So the object became an internet object, which is a cat. And then the ornament on the pedestal became mice. Sorry.
Ovgu, please, let's wrap it up so we can have time for conversation.
Okay, so it became mice, and the ornamentation wasn't as rigorous as the curse. So yeah, and then the third one was looking at this gate. Again, pedestal, gates, columns, and then objects. And then this is what came out. The plant in the original one became a mushroom. And then this is the resulting object. And there's this dome. It's a prayer space, sphere cut in the front, and then there's spikes on top of it. So the same thing, there's a sphere cut in the front, but then there's now sharks instead of spikes. And then this is a thing. So this concludes my miniatures. And okay, I have actually came up with my own conclusions of like what are the rules in this process. And looking ahead, I came up with a couple of questions to ask myself, which is, what is the nature of this thesis? Am I designing something, or am I researching? Am I making buildings? Am I coming up with a code? What does this meme architecture aim to convey? Is it a tone, modes? Is it a set of codes? Is it a specific story? And is it a code of practice? So that concludes my presentation, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Ovgu. I think these are great questions actually to lead to conversation.
And my entire presentation is on the Miro board.
And maybe as people think about what they want to say, I mean, I could add, I think this is specifically a thesis where, you know, the question is more cultural than, let's say, architectural. And so I think it brings us to this struggle of what other questions that are aesthetic and architectural could be brought to the table, but also, again, like how do you convey this work, right? We've talked about how it probably should not be a building.
I think it actually in a way is it's hyper architectural, I would say, because it deals with ornament. It deals with ornament, which for a long time was what made a building architecture. So for most of the history of architecture, you had to have ornament in order to translate something from the kind of the bare life of a building to the higher art of architecture. And it seems to me like you're doing a pretty seamless translation of what ornament might be like today, stripped of symbolic meaning, but given over to the aura of cultural effects and nuances, and kind of like that kind of glistening digital surface of just kind of mood and affect, yeah. Which is interesting to then put that. It's funny because like I almost feel like you're not framing the project in the way that you've done such a good job asking yourself questions and being really rigorous in your process. And so that's not what I'm talking, like that framing I think is great. Just you're being just very self-conscious about laying the groundwork. You're like paving your own road under your feet, which is very impressive. And I applaud that. Very rigorous. But I mean, you may actually need to give up the emphasis that you're placing on memes in the beginning, which immediately I thought I was going to be seeing a critical project. With the way that you set that up and the way that you frame that in terms of irony and sincerity and those other kinds of things, I thought this is going to be a critical project. And my heart sank a little bit because I was like, I don't know if we're in a critical project moment in 2020 and COVID-19, et cetera, et cetera. But then when you finished, it was like this joyous kind of like sharks replacing spikes. And the going to Le Queue, I think, is a totally brilliant move. For you actually, and one that kind of just pulls the whole thing into the realm of the imagination, the realm of plenty, the realm of too much stuff, and the realm of kind of delight and unexpectedness and whimsy, as opposed to irony and communication through symbols. In fact, you're removing symbolism from the equation, which is very much, I think, in the moment that we are in architecturally. So I don't know, I feel like Zaina, I feel like she's actually like really architectural, even more architectural than the other two students that we just saw.
That's really, yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. I wonder, I mean, we could say that the questions that you're dealing with are architectural, but perhaps the manifestation of the questions is not necessarily the building. Maybe that's what I'm trying to say. That, and something that I think Ovgu needs help with is, you know, to what extent this becomes a cabinet of curiosity, like perhaps a box, a Duchamp box, maybe that's the thesis, that combines all of these kind of aesthetics of like maximalism, and these rules. I mean, to some extent, memes have, it's true, they do have a kind of codification to them. They are directed to a specific audience. They're only understood by a narrow privileged audience, you know, not privileged, but meaning an audience or generation that understands the underlying codes of the image, the meme that is being collaged. And there are very kind of little hidden codes in the image that allow us to read. So you have to kind of become literate to be able to understand a meme. And I find that to be a really fascinating, perhaps, way of understanding memes, and maybe something we could take into some of these architectural questions. So again, to what extent is it about producing memes, and to what extent is it about learning from how memes operate in the world? Their kind of low resolution, their maximalism, but also their codification. And maybe that's a way to sort of take the structure of memes and work on that.
My casual suggestion, and it's not meant to be, it's just, I'm throwing it out there in case it's helpful, not in any advisory capacity, obviously, but my casual suggestion would be to totally turn it into like a series of buildings. I think it should be like a block, like a district amount of buildings. And I think these buildings should have tight relationships to each other and should create this like mesmerizing, spiky silhouette in the city. And I think that pushing you into what it would be like to retrofit these strange objects with program could be really awesome, actually. Like you would have to find a way to like put stuff in them, not build stuff from the inside out, but just kind of like have this strange collapse. It's kind of like Lequeur's cow, right? Or like Lequeur's hunting gate. He's trying to find these pockets of architectural possibility that allow for whimsy to be expressed. And I think that what was not available to him, which is available to you, is the idea that you could literally take a little piece of the city and populate it with a completely other excuse me completely other architectural idiom, and just see what it does. Like that's available to us now. In his time, no, that was state architecture. But in our time, could be. I can imagine coming across like something like the site of like the flower market in Los Angeles or something like that, just coming across something like that and just being like, holy shit, what did I just see? Populated with your buildings.
I was thinking especially in Los Angeles. I was thinking especially in Los Angeles because we have so many roadside attractions with donut holes and other types of things. So maybe here I come back to one of Brian's comments about looking at Venturi's cut brown and in particular some of the photographs of the ducks and but I also wanted to say that we only have a minute left of go, so maybe I can kind of ask each one of the guests today, Ben and Maya and Brian and Ryan, to make a comment maybe about your project, but also if you'd like to share a general thought, kind of to leave all of the students with something to consider since you've gone through the process of thesis. And we really do hope that you'll be able to return and to see some of these projects as they develop throughout the summer. So I'd like to kind of open it up a little bit to everybody who's here.
I guess
just one word. I mean, I completely agree with everything that was said on the last project. And I think that it's all going to come down to if you just completely go with their comments, I think your project comes down to resolution. And it's the level of resolution that will give it. I think the critique will be in the resolution of your project is what I'm trying to say. Because if those didn't have the sort of savant or master, sorry, I haven't eaten all day, so I'm starting to like lose my mind, mastery of those drawings that you were showing. If they were a low-res cow, it wouldn't have been like an iconic project. So I think that if your project is low-res, like when you were showing your cow, that was sort of this like low-res cow. Mm-hmm. But I mean, like what if those architects were allowed today, right? Like there would be, I mean, the level of resolution would be uncanny on the project, and that's where I think you have to start to play within it. And maybe it was a critique when I was looking at yours, like when you were even showing the cloth, it was a very low resolution cloth that was on the project. So I think that that's maybe something, maybe that was an intentional, that it's starting to look like this sort of cute manner rather than like this hyper serious manner. And I know that's where you're kind of like trying to work with it.
I was just going to say, since we're on this last slide where it says, what is the nature of this thesis? I think at the end of the day, it's what you say it is, but also maybe what you don't say. So the idea of the meme, there's so many memes out there would say, I don't get it. And it's not your fault if someone's not smart enough to understand the kind of joke, and you don't have to explain it to people. So I would just recommend maybe editing the kind of narrative of the project and let the work kind of speak for itself. I love Marika's comment about this thing actually becoming a kind of, a kind of building or a kind of little mini intersection. Like, let's say it's the headquarters for Reddit. I don't know, it could be kind of funny or a witticism in some ways. But I would just say keep producing. I'm kind of interested more in the kind of precedent drawings and the relationship to the precedent drawings than I am the initial research. But at the end of the day, it's your project, and we can give you feedback all day long. But at the end of the day, you have to make a decision about this. And so I'd encourage you to consider things, but also to really kind of keep moving forward with what you think is best for the project. It was very interesting.
Thank you, Ryan. I think that's a really helpful comment for Angu to hear. There've been so many different sort of advice and approaches and feedback about what you might do and how this thesis could look like, Ovgu. And I think as of now, you haven't really decided what you are the most passionate about in terms of like how you're imagining the final thing to look like. And so I agree with Ryan that it's something that needs to come from you, because you've definitely been, you know, from your colleagues or your friends, but also like faculty and others and me have suggested different sort of lives that this could take on. But I would agree that you need to decide and figure out what's the scale, let's say, that you're the most passionate about, and what's the format and medium that you think this would be.
I don't know if you can find it, but there was just a show pre-COVID in New York on Q, and it had like some amazing drawings, and they put together, I believe you could find like a complete book on or just try to find the show. But I mean, I really love the one project where it's actually like kind of a collage of multiple projects of his, where he actually produced a labyrinth from the projects. It's like just a section, and it's just kind of like this project sort of collaged together. Maybe that's even a way of starting to like understand and produce like a new holistic object out of these.
Final comment. I don't know if that's going to be useful, but I mean I do love the prompt that Zena also put on the table for the thesis as a means of like something that we didn't think is architecture. It's just a cultural product of our ubiquitous image culture, and how do we start to understand them and read them as architects and actually put them back out in the world. I think it's really difficult, but it's really, really interesting. And I love that you started to tackle that. And I would like to, I mean, that's maybe also common for everyone, but I do think in your case particular, to echo the comments on what do you think is funny? I have a very weird sense of humor, for example. So memes to me, like I only share them when they already evolved into something else. Like they don't have the image and the message are completely divorced from one another, and then they're funny to me. Right now your project seems be stuck in the first sort of phase of the grumpy cat, right? Where it's like you see a picture of a grumpy cat and then it says grumpy cat below it. But there's obviously an evolution of that, and a sort of clashing and destabilizing of different kind of things, where an image of the grumpy cat now has a quote or a tweet from Trump under it, and then I think that's funny. So the sort of clashing of different kind of things, and the ideas that then turns to you saying where do you see the cultural relevance, and how do you translate that into architecture? Where do you put your stake onto it and your thesis into it? But ultimately, I mean, just on a personal level, I do think a good thesis is the one that is not just contained. Now my I don't know if you guys hear it, but my dog is barking at me because he's done with this review. But just on a general level, I think a good thesis is the one that continues to evolve. So especially in this moment in your thesis where everything could be on the table and you could go anywhere, just know that it will continue. Like these interests that you're building up right now, they're not going away. You just, right now you need to focus on one thing and then continue to work on it. And it's, for the better or worse, it's not going to end.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful comment to end in some ways, that what you guys are working on in your thesis are not just simply topics. And in some ways, a good thesis is not just a topic. It's also a thesis where you begin to articulate for yourself ways of working, ways of producing things, making things, but also where you claim in some ways your position as a designer and architect vis-a-vis cultural, political, aesthetic questions. And I think in some ways, like, even though it seems like, if Ovgu, in your case, like the meme project is still kind of a question mark in terms of what it will become, I agree, you are in some ways finding deep interest, you have a kind of passion for this, and you're asking self-reflective existential questions about how one works and how you could make things based on a topic, but also how you could ask bigger questions that are extracted from a topic. So I think it's a really interesting thing to kind of leave today with, which is that a thesis, again, is not just one thing. It's a topic, let's say, is a kind of alibi for figuring out how one could work and how one could practice moving forward, which I think is a really beautiful idea.
If I may reply to what Ryan said. So I kept the thesis title the same ever since thesis prep, and it's called Deal With It. And I was actually very happy that you brought up that it's not the fault of who's making the meme, that some people just don't get it. It's just there and they're not putting in the work to actually understand it. Like one big part of this thesis has from the beginning is to make the audience put in the work to understand the content that they're confronted with, instead of saying, I don't understand, and then move away. And that's the thing that I kind of was trying to bring up, was saying, we live in a world where everything happens at once. Like that confrontational move was always the fascination with this entire thesis. So I'm actually very encouraged by the fact that like without me specifically bringing this up, this has been brought up by you. Like, I don't know, thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Ovgu. Thanks to everybody. It's so inspiring to see all of you come back and join us today. And I think for our students especially, because, you know, in like a month, they're going to be in your shoes and we're all going to be kind of out in the world together. So Maya and Ben and Brian and Ryan, thank you so much for joining us. To Marika and Eric, also a special thanks for jumping in, and Florencia. And I think on that note, I'd like to really thank you. It's been a really amazing morning discussion with so many diverse and beautiful projects, and I've been inspired, so I'd love to see, I can't wait to see where we go next.
Ovgu, please unshare.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Anna.
Congratulations. Good luck.
Thank you, everyone.
Stay safe,
Thanks,
everyone.
everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.